Welcome to Chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. It's called the Yoga of Analysis. So last time we covered Chapter 1, and just to review it very quickly, the quick summary of Chapter 1, which was the Yoga of Despair, was that attachments render us weak and confused, and when we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change. So now Arjun has hit his lowest point, and he is open to the greatest of change. The question that we were left with last time, when Arjun fell silent, cast down his bow, and sat down overcome with grief, was the following. When we become too attached to things we cannot preserve, and we're in a state of utter despair, what do? That is where Chapter 2 picks up. Chapter 2 is Sankhya Yoga, or the Yoga of Analysis. Okay? Now before we go into this long summary, which is actually very helpful, we will begin again with Satyanarayan Das's quick summary of Chapter 2 in his translation of the Gita. Okay? So Chapter 2 is called Sankhya Yoga, the path of analysis. The Yoga of Analysis, or the path of analytic knowledge. Those are all synonymous. All right? The second chapter begins with Sanjay's description of Sri Krishna's response upon observing Arjun overwhelmed with grief. This chapter has 72 verses, 3 spoken by Sanjay, 8 by Arjun, and 61 by Sri Krishna. First, Krishna expresses surprise on witnessing Arjun's cowardly behavior. He shows no sympathy and commands Arjun to rise and shake off his petty faint-heartedness. Arjun defends his stance, saying, "It is better to live on alms in this world than to kill those great honorable men, because even after killing them, all my enjoyments here in the form of wealth and sense pleasures would be stained with their blood." Very rational argument, incredible argument, very compassionate argument. Although Arjun declines to fight, he is evidently not very sure of his own decision. Seeing that Krishna is not supportive of his unwillingness to fight and instead ridicules him, his mind becomes filled with doubt. He surrenders to Krishna and asks him to become his teacher. Ironically, immediately following his submission, Arjun declares his determination not to fight. Now, Krishna begins his instructions by first repudiating Arjun for making a show of wisdom while yet overwhelmed by sorrow. Krishna first clarifies that the body, which is called the sharir in Sanskrit, and the self, which is called the atma, are entirely distinct from each other. The body is transitory, limited, and perishable, while the self, or the atma, or the spirit soul, is eternal, real, and imperishable. Therefore, one should neither lament the destruction of the perishable, nor aspire to maintain the imperishable. This is discernment. Write this down. This is discernment, because the definition of Sankhya is discernment. Discernment is needed in all 3 disciplines of yoga. Remember, there are 3 types of yoga. The yoga of action, which is Karam Yoga. The yoga of knowledge, which is Jnana Yoga, or Sankhya Yoga. And finally, the yoga of devotion, or Bhakti Yoga. When a person distinguishes between the self and the body, the desire for liberation, or the freedom from material bondage, is aroused. Even the desire for heaven assumes the knowledge of the difference between the self, which endures, and the physical body, which perishes. Therefore, Krishna begins his instructions with the discussion of discernment, a topic that continues through verse 30. Now, we keep hearing this term discernment come up, but we need to understand what that actually means, and as soon as we switch over to my doc, we will. Instead of using philosophical terminology, Krishna uses simple words to enable people to understand the topic easily. The idea is that every person deserves the opportunity to realize God, because the human form has been bestowed upon us specifically for this purpose, which is the utter fulfillment of the self's potential as an eternal conscious entity. Therefore, every human being can realize God by first understanding the importance of discernment. In this section, the term intellect has not been used by Krishna. In order to distinguish the real from the unreal, the imperishable from the perishable, the eternal from the transitory, and the self from the body, discernment is all that is necessary. Just keep this in mind. We have a Venn diagram. On one side, we have the unreal, and on the other side, we have the real. The qualities of the unreal are that it is temporary and perishable and transitory, and the body is unreal. On the other side of the Venn diagram, we have that which is real, The real is imperishable, it's eternal, and the Atma, or the self, or the spirit soul, is an example of that. The ability to distinguish between these two categories of the Venn diagram is called Sankhya. It's called analysis, it's called discernment. Write that down. That is why this chapter is called the Yoga of Analysis, or Discernment, or Sankhya Yoga. Because we need to understand the difference between that which is temporary and that which is eternal in a Venn diagram. Right? I guess it's not a Venn diagram, it's more so a chart, because there is not an overlap. The only overlap is that which is eternal and that which is temporary all are part of God. So in that sense, that's the overlap. But does that make sense? Sankhya Yoga is the yoga of discernment. It is about discerning or distinguishing between, that's a better word, that which is temporary, which is the body, material nature. Look right here, Prakriti, which we talked about in the introduction video, like all the elements that make up this world. And then that which is eternal, which is the self, or the Atma. Okay? Discernment is all that is necessary. As both Prakriti and Purush, material nature, and by the way, the body is just one aspect of material nature, right? Because the same elements that make up my body make up a tree, right? It's the same hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, neon, sodium, magnesium, etc., right? So when we say Prakriti, included within Prakriti is the body, because the body is nothing but a collection of the same constitutive elements, right? So as both Prakriti and Purush are beginningless, so is the faculty of discernment, which distinguishes the real from the unreal. Okay, now this is interesting. We're saying that the things that are temporary are beginningless. How is that possible? Things that are unreal are also beginningless, right? Temporary things are unreal things, and those things are beginningless. They're beginningless because God doesn't actually create anything. Everything already exists as it is, and God just puts things into motions. The things that have always existed but change are asat, are the body, are prakriti, material nature. The things that have always existed but don't change, that are sat, in that sense eternal, are spiritual, the Purush. Discernment has been bestowed upon all creatures by God and is revealed in the intellect. Even birds and beasts know instinctively what should and should not be eaten by them, and can distinguish between heat and cold, yet they are devoid of discernment in the matter of spiritual intelligence. Human beings are especially endowed with this discernment, which can release them from the bondage of birth and death and lead to eternal peace and bliss, or liberation. When discernment is aroused, enabling individuals to distinguish between the self and the body, they renounce their affinity for the transitory objects of this world, including the senses, the mind, and the intellect. As a consequence, their intellect becomes purified and balanced. So what this means is that as soon as you can distinguish between that which is temporary, prakriti, or the body, and that which is eternal and unchanging, which is the self, you immediately are not attracted to the world. And as a result of that, you may give up action, right? And if you give up action, now you're just sitting there meditating away. Okay, and that is called Sankhya Yoga, or Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge or the yoga of analysis. When you understand the difference between the body and the self, you realize that there is no reason to act in the world because everything that you're engaging in is temporary, and therefore you retire from action. And in fact, that's actually what Arjun wants to do. His whole argument is, look, I'm in the middle of this battlefield, I have all these problems, I have to kill all of my relatives. It's better that I go and meditate in a forest, right? But no. Krishna, as we'll see, advises against that. He said, this is one path, Jnana Yoga or Sankhya Yoga, which is good, because we should discern and distinguish between the body and the self. That is good. But an average person like you and me does not have the spiritual discipline to sit down and meditate without performing any action in the world. Because as soon as we sit down to meditate, our mind will start to move and think. And so Krishna says it's better to perform action with a spirit of detachment as opposed to being detached from performing any action at all. Okay? And we'll get into that. I'm just hinting at it now so that everything I say becomes clear with time. When you distinguish between the body and the self, that gives rise to detachment. That's called Sankhya Yoga. As a result of that, you can either sit down and not do any action and meditate in a forest and give up the world, renounce the world, or, which is called Sankhya Yoga, or with that knowledge of the difference between the body and the self, you can engage in action with the spirit of selfless detachment. That is called Karam Yoga. But the spirit of this chapter is to distinguish or discern between the body and the self. Therefore, again, it is called the yoga of analysis or Sankhya Yoga. After completing his exposition on the nature of the self, Krishna tries to convince Arjuna to participate in the battle, because that is his duty as a Kshatriya. Remember, in the ancient Vedic Varnashram system, there were 4 Varns, or I guess you could say occupational groups. One of them were the Kshatriyas, or the warriors who would fight. Krishna argues that if Arjuna does not fight, his enemies will ridicule him. Thus, even for the sake of his honor, he should fight with a balanced state of mind. Later in the chapter, Krishna tells Arjuna, I have spoken this wisdom to you in relation to Sankhya Yoga. Right? He says, I've told you the path of Sankhya Yoga, which is detachment based upon the discernment between the body and the self. Then Krishna says, now hear the same in terms of Karam Yoga, the path of selfless action offered to God. And so one of the central dilemmas in the Gita is whether one should follow the path of Sankhya Yoga, distinguishing between the body and the self, and thus, as a result, becoming detached from the world and detached from action and meditating in a forest, or having that same realization but acting in the world with a spirit of selflessness and detachment. Equipped with wisdom, you will be able to completely relinquish the shackles of karma. Now, interestingly, karma means 2 things. Karma means both action and the result of action. Okay? But karma is not the same as karma yoga. You see this? Karma is action with attachment, which gives rise to good and bad results that you have to experience. Whereas Karam Yoga is action with detachment. And as a result of that, and we'll see this, as a result of action with detachment, you don't have to bear the good or bad consequences. You become free from them. You don't experience them. You become peaceful and above all suffering and pleasure. Keep that in mind. Isn't that fascinating? We tend to think that suffering is not favorable and that pleasure is favorable. The Gita actually is very much against that position. Suffering is unfavorable and pleasure is also unfavorable, because pleasure gives rise to more and more desires which will never be fulfilled. And pleasure is not the same as peace. Peace is what we want, but pleasure is just material attachment. When people firmly resolve to attain liberation or moksha, favorable or unfavorable circumstances cause no obstacles, and thus they attain equanimity. When people resolve to attain realization of God, their attachment and attraction to the world begins to disappear. Attachment to pleasures, power, and prosperity is the main obstacle to the attainment of mental resolution. And this isn't critical. The problem isn't with objects, power, prosperity, or relations, but with the attachment to them. Therefore, these things are not to be shunned in and of themselves. Write this down. But the attachment to them should be. It's not that anything you have in life is bad, right? If I have a car, does that mean I should just become detached and start walking around? No. A car serves a practical purpose. As long as I'm not attached to the car and I'm driving around in this Lambo and I'm flexing and I'm thinking I'm better than other people, as long as I'm detached, things should not be shunned in and of themselves. Now, of course, some things should be shunned, right? Like stealing is not something you should do. But in general, objects, as long as we use them without attachment, that's practical. Attachment to them should be shunned. And this is the theme which is repeated throughout the Bhagavad Gita. Having emphasized stability of mind in the discipline of action, Krishna requests Arjuna to perform his duty with evenness of mind. He declares, your eligibility pertains exclusively to the fulfillment of action, but never to the fruits thereof. Do not become the cause of the results of your action by claiming that you are the doer. Nor should you be attached to not doing anything, right? Perform your duties, being steadfast in yoga. Krishna also declares that action performed for its fruits is inferior to action performed without a desire for the fruits, which is called Karam Yoga, or the yoga of wisdom, or Buddhi Yoga, which we'll talk about briefly. Duty performed with motive is verily far inferior to this yoga of wisdom, Karam Yoga. Karam Yoga and Nishkam Karam Yoga are the same thing. Nishkam just is a modifier, an adjective, which means Kam means desire, Nish means no. So Karam Yoga is that yoga which is performed without a desire. Krishna says, take refuge in this wisdom. Those who act for results are pitiable. He then declares, being endowed with this equanimity of mind, one abandons in this life both pious and impious deeds. He abandons pious deeds. That's very fascinating. That's a transformative idea. Therefore, strive for yoga. Yoga, or equanimity and selfless action, is dexterity in the execution of action. The essence of these verses is that one should be mindful of one's actions and not be attached to the result in its aftermath. It should be noted that in Jnana Yoga, which is also called Sankhya Yoga, discrimination between the body and self is predominant. In Bhakti Yoga, surrender and faith are predominant. While in Karma Yoga, resolute intellect is predominant. Arjun then asks about the characteristics of a person of resolute intellect. How does such a person function in the world, and how does he act when he is alone? Krishna's reply to Arjun makes up the remainder of the chapter. Krishna explains that when a person's mind becomes free of all material desires, the intellect becomes fixed. One who meditates on sense objects becomes attached to them, which leads to desire to attain them, which further results in anger if we don't get what we want. Anger makes one deluded, resulting in loss of memory, which destroys one's intelligence. Following such a course, a person is utterly ruined. Krishna lays great stress on control of the senses. A person who has mastered his senses is like an ocean that remains within its bounds in spite of being filled by the numerous rivers that enter. Yeah, think about that imagery. We'll get to this when we read the actual chapter, but it's essentially an image of an ocean with a bunch of tributary rivers flowing in. A person who has mastered his senses is like an ocean. All the senses are like the rivers. They're constantly coming in, but instead of making a splash and being disturbed, the ocean remains still because its volume is so high. A person who has mastered his senses is like an ocean that remains within its bounds in spite of being filled by the numerous rivers that enter it. Such a person attains supreme peace and freedom from bondage to material nature. Okay? So let's go here. We're going to begin now with a summary of Chapter 2, Sankhya Yoga, the Yoga of Analysis. Keep in mind that this is, I think, the longest chapter of the Gita. It is the most complex, okay, because it's very long. And why is it the most complex? I'll tell you in a moment. So a few quick points. Sankhya means the analytical study of matter versus spirit. I already talked about this. Being able to distinguish or discern between matter, which is temporary, and spirit, which is the self, which is eternal, is called Sankhya. This chapter, which is called Sankhya Yoga, also serves as a summary of the entire Gita. Okay? This is a quote from the version of the Gita that we're about to read. Krishna's instructions in this chapter, by which he seeks to remove Arjun's despair, remember the first chapter is called Arjuna Vishada Yoga, constitute a sutra-like summary of the Gita's contents. Okay? So that's why this is a very complex chapter, because Krishna is essentially summarizing the entire text in 72 verses. That's very hard to do, but that's why I broke it down. So, because this entire chapter is a summary of the Gita, I want you to look out for the blue, pink, and orange highlights, okay? Because chapter 2 is a summary, because it discusses the three types of yoga: Sankhya Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. So Sankhya is in blue, Karma Yoga is in pink, and Bhakti Yoga is in orange. And keep in mind that this is the most significant part, all right? Don't forget that. This. Krishna only talks about this very briefly in this chapter, but it's so significant that it's been highlighted, all of it in orange. And just keep in mind, anytime you see blue, we're talking about Sankhya Yoga, okay? Quick summary. This is just like we had a quick summary of the first chapter, which was attachments render us weak and confused. When we hit our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change. The summary of this chapter is discernment between the body and the self is known as Sankhya Yoga. When this discernment is aroused, detachment naturally follows, and one's desire to perform action fades away. Okay? Meaning you want to go and meditate in a forest. Attachment to pleasure, power, and prosperity impedes spiritual progress. Now, as compared to Sankhya Yoga, Karma Yoga is the path of selfless action, which can also bring about detachment. Detachment can be brought out by Sankhya and Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is a different path that Krishna is going to advocate for, actually, in the first 6 chapters of this text. He's going to talk about every path, but he is advising Arjun to do Karma Yoga. Now, this is very difficult. How can you perform action without being attached to the results with a spirit of detachment? This is very difficult. And so Krishna says that meditation on Krishna is the higher taste that makes such detachment possible. In other words, we can't artificially become detached from the result of our action. We're always going to think about the results of action. I mean, it's very difficult not to. But when we meditate on Krishna, which is called Bhakti Yoga, we experience a higher taste, a padam drishtva, that makes detachment possible. And thus, in that sense, Karma Yoga, in its most mature stage, is not just the path of selfless action, but rather the path of selfless action offered to God. Meaning, Karma Yoga is when you perform an action without being attached to the results in a selfless way. This is very difficult. But if you do it in a selfless way, and also as an offering to God, those actions now become a form of devotion. So in that sense, on one side you have Sankhya Yoga, on the other side you have Karma Yoga. And when that Karma Yoga is transformed a little bit, so it's not just selfless action without attachment to the results, but selfless action without attachment to the results, and those results are offered to God as a sacrifice, like I'm doing this for you, God. And then it's Bhakti Yoga. So Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga overlap in that sense. Still a distinction, because Bhakti Yoga is not just that. Bhakti Yoga is more than that. It's not just performing action for God selflessly, but there are other aspects of it, right? Which we'll get into later in the text. This is a long text, okay? 18 chapters. Some quick terms. I'm going to say this again. I'm going to say this 100 times, because if I say it 100 times, then you'll understand it. Sankhya Yoga is a path of detachment based upon the discernment between the body and the self. It's the realization that I'm not the body, but rather a spirit soul. I've discerned the difference between the body and the soul. Then I ask myself, why then get entangled in material attachments and actions? As a result, I renounce action altogether, which is called Karam Sannyas. Thus, knowledge of the eternal self, knowledge that the self and the body are different, curbs the desire to act in a world that does not endure. So that's why I say Sankhya Yoga, the natural conclusion of Sankhya Yoga is the body and the self are different. Therefore, I shouldn't perform any action in a world that is temporary, and therefore I should go and meditate in a forest. Okay? Now, the Gita is very fancy. It uses a lot of different terms for the same idea. Sankhya Yoga is also called the path of analytic knowledge, or Gyan Yoga. And in the 18th chapter, Krishna also calls it the path of renunciation of action, or Karam Sannyas. Why? Because, like I said, when you understand the difference between the body and the self, you develop a spirit of detachment, and because of that detachment, you decide that you do not want to perform any action in the world. You renounce action and go and meditate in a forest. So all three of these are the same thing. So Sankhya Yoga has two elements. Sankhya Yoga, the first element is discerning between the body and the self, which is what this entire chapter is about. The second element is giving up action. Okay? So Sankhya, write this down in an equation, like you're in math class. Sankhya Yoga equals Gyan Yoga equals Karma Sannyas. Okay? Now, for Karma Yoga, it's also important that you understand the difference between the body and self. That's like you have to do that no matter what. The difference is that in Karma Yoga, which is also called Nishkam Karma Yoga, that form of yoga is the path of selfless action, okay? Or performing one's prescribed duties without attachment to the results. Karma Yoga is also given another name. Just like Sankhya Yoga is called Gyan Yoga and Karma Sannyas, Karma Yoga is called Buddhi Yoga. It's the path of wisdom. Now, wisdom is everywhere. Sankhya Yoga has wisdom too, but we're going to call Karma Yoga the path of wisdom because it is action or yoga done with proper wisdom, which is buddhi. Buddhi is the Sanskrit term for intellect. So if you use your intellect to perform action, you won't be attached to the results. So that's why Karma Yoga is also called Buddhi Yoga. Now, another term for this in the 18th chapter for Karma Yoga is Tyag. Anyone who knows Sanskrit, Tyag just means to give up something. So it's also called the path of renunciation of the fruits of action, which is literally what I said here. Performing one's prescribed duties without attachment to the results or the fruits of action. Now, why do I have this and sacred and offering to God here? Because, a technical point, performing selfless action as a sacrifice or offering to God, meaning now it's sacred and it's offered to God, transforms Karma Yoga, remember our highlighting, red or pink is Karma Yoga, into Bhakti Yoga. Thus, Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga become one. Note, however, that Bhakti Yoga is much more than this too. So Karma Yoga, when it's action performed as an offering to God, selflessly, becomes a form of Bhakti Yoga, but Bhakti Yoga is actually much more than that. It has 9 different aspects to it, which we'll get to later. But one of those aspects is selfless action as an offering to God. Okay? So now, I've said this about 50 times. You should know the difference between Sankhya Yoga and Karma Yoga, and also how Bhakti Yoga, it is very similar to Karma Yoga. When Karma Yoga reaches its mature stage and acts are done not just selflessly, but as an offering to God, it is called Bhakti Yoga. If you don't understand what I've said 50 times, compassionately I'm saying, go back and watch the video again, the first 25 minutes, because I've said it so many times, because this is an idea where if you read the text yourself, you will never understand. One has to have read this book, this text, at least half a dozen times to get this content. It's so tough. Okay, now let's do a quick summary. I want to do this in 25 minutes, and then we're going to spend an hour or so or less, so that this video is roughly 2 hours or less, okay? This is very hard to do in 2 hours, but we're going to do it. This document took a very long time to prepare, several hours, and no AI was used, because AI sucks at this type of stuff. This is all my own work inspired by the commentary in the Gita we're reading, and of course I have learned, I stand on the shoulders of giants. None of this is my own invention. I'm not brilliant in that way. I'm just sharing what I've learned. So quick summary. In 146, the previous chapter, the last verse of the previous chapter was, having spoken thus, Arjun sat down in his chariot and cast aside his bow and arrows, his heart overcome with grief. In 2:1, Arjun's eyes are full of tears and he's overwhelmed with despair. Okay? He doesn't know what to do. And so in 2:2 and 2:3, Krishna now begins to dismantle all of Arjun's arguments. Right now, in 2:2 and 2:3, Krishna has a bit of a harsh tone. He's rebuking Arjun. Keep that in mind. He has a little bit of a harsh tone, right? Like if you have a parent or a teacher and the student or child messes up, sometimes the parent has to be a little harsh. You know, there's a role for that. It's not cruel. It's not abuse. It's just a little harshness, a little toughness, a little tough love. So Krishna, who is known as Sri Bhagavan, surgically dismantles all of Arjun's arguments that he made in the previous chapter, in 131 to 145. He rebukes Arjun for his faint-heartedness and tells him that his arguments are, quote, not befitting a noble person or an Aryan. Okay? They will make him infamous and unfit for heaven. Okay? And this heaven, by the way, is not the same as liberation. So in this tradition, the ancient Vedic tradition, heaven is like the Abrahamic heaven, the heaven that other religious traditions believe about, a place of enjoyment where after dying you go to basically have infinite pleasure, right? That infinite pleasure is not the highest goal in the Vedic system, in the Hindu tradition. The highest goal is liberation, freedom from all desire, so that we can attain a state of eternal bliss where we are serving God, not serving ourselves with pleasure. So in this tradition, heaven is called what's called heaven, because that is a term that is commonly used, that is very understandable for English speakers. But the actual term in Sanskrit is Svarg Lok. Okay? Whereas liberation is moksha. Okay? And when you get moksha, there are many types of moksha. There are many types of liberation, which we won't get into now. It's a more complex topic. He then tells Arjun to get up and fight, because Arjun is the son of Indra, the king of heaven. This is very beautiful. We're doing some literary analysis here. Arjun's mother was married, or not married, she had a son with Indra, who is the king of heaven, the Devta of heaven. He's not the supreme lord. Krishna is the supreme god. Indra is like a celestial god who controls the heavens and the rains and weather and stuff like that. So Krishna is reminding Arjun, you're the son of the king of heaven, who's very powerful. So you're tough like that. You should get up and fight. 2:4 to 2:5, Arjun asks why he should fight his venerable elders, Bhishma, Pitama, and Dronacharya. Remember, Krishna is asking Arjun to defeat his elders, his gurus, who are on the other side, because those people are on the side of injustice. Dronacharya and Bhishma Pitama are worthy of Arjun's worship, yet Arjun is expected to throw arrows at them rather than flowers, right? Because in traditional Hindu society, you throw flowers at your gurus out of a sign of respect, but Krishna is asking them to throw arrows, right? That's a poetic way of making this point. Arjun prefers to live a life of a beggar rather than performing such an act. So in this heightened state of anxiety, this is just an interesting fact, the meter of the Gita changes from the Anustub meter to the Trishtub, the Anushtub to the Trishtub, okay? Because remember, the Gita is a work of poetry. It's written in stanzas. And what is the significance of this? So far, it's been 4 lines of 8 syllables each, so 32 syllables total. right? So for example, when I say the first verse of the Gita, Dharma kshetre kurukshetre, or no, Dharma kshetre kurukshetre, that's eight syllables. So far we've had 4 lines of 8 syllables. Now it changes to 4 lines of 11 syllables. It's faster. Or it's not faster, it's more condensed. And this is also known as the Kshatriya meter, because the war is about to start. So the tension is rising, and so the meter of the text changes. So it's just a cool fact to know. Right? The verses after this, some of them, not every single verse after this in the entire text, will be 4 lines of 11 syllables. Right? So, Dharma kshetre kurukshetre samavetayo yutsavaha mamaka pandavascheva kimakurvata sanjayah. Each one there was 4 lines of 8 syllables each. Anyways, Arjun is completely bewildered and unsure of what to do. This is critical. Remember in 1.3, Dronacharya, if you didn't get that, go back to the first chapter video. In verse 1.3 of the Gita, Dronacharya is Duryodhana's guru, and Duryodhana approaches him with arrogance and a lack of respect. He thinks he knows all the answers. Arjun doesn't do that. Arjun approaches his guru Krishna with respect and love. He wants to know what is best for him. He's completely bewildered and unsure of what to do. He thus demonstrates his eligibility to approach a guru. We approach a guru or a teacher when we don't know what to do. We're not arrogant, like I know what is right. When we have questions, we go to a teacher. And because Arjun is bewildered and he has questions, he is eligible to approach his teacher. Versus Duryodhana, who thinks he has all the answers, so he's not going to seek the advice of those who are wiser than him. And because of that, because he's going to fight on his own strength, without seeking the wisdom of his elders, he will fail. So in 2.7, this is one of the most significant verses so far, Arjun says, Shishyasteham shadimam tvam prapannam. He wants to know what is best for him, and he surrenders to Krishna for guidance. Shishya means a student. And so Arjun becomes Krishna's student. He briefly then refuses to fight. Now, in 2.10, Krishna smiles with affection to encourage Arjun. Imagine you're sad or depressed, and you're really confused. Sometimes something as simple as a gesture from someone else can give you optimism and positivity. So Krishna is doing that. His smile symbolizes his mood of friendship and servitude for Arjun. He's going to serve Arjun. He's driving his chariot. Because although Krishna rebuked Arjun just in verses 2.2 to 2.3, he was a little harsh here, Krishna. Krishna is saying, okay, bro as in friend, now that you've surrendered to me, you've already told me that you're my disciple, and you're so humble. I'm not going to criticize you now. I'm going to smile and teach you with love. 2.11, Krishna tells Arjun that the wise, or the pandits, do not lament either for the living or the dead. Right? Why? Because those who have died have merely gone elsewhere. Because remember, Arjun's central dilemma is that he has to fight with his family members on the other side. So Arjun doesn't want to hurt them. But Krishna says, the departed have merely gone elsewhere. When someone passes on, it's not like they've died. Their body has died. Their body has no permanence. Okay? But they still exist eternally. So we should learn to pass through our suffering without identifying with it. Krishna is saying that you shouldn't make your whole identity about being a victim. The people whom you're going to fight, they will have departed anyways. And the body has no permanence. So the people whom you are fighting are merely bodies. And this verse is very important because it marks the beginning of Krishna's instructions to Arjuna. So far, and this is very important, most of the text has been Arjun sharing his problems. Someone who is a great leader, a great teacher, the first thing they do is they very calmly listen to the question that is being asked of them. That is what Krishna's done. So far, Krishna has been almost silent. He had 1 or 2 verses, I believe 1 in the first chapter, and a few so far. He's really wanted to understand where his student is worried, what he's worried about, and where he stands. Okay? He's listened to Arjun's problems, and now he's going to begin his instructions to Arjun. And this is the transition from what is called Dharam Jigyasa, religious life, to Brahm Jigyasa, spiritual life. Because so far, all of Arjun's arguments have been from a religious point of view. What did he say? He said, I have no desire for victory or pleasure. I have no desire to kill those bent on killing me, even for power. And by the way, I just came back to chapter 1. How can I be happy with the sin of killing my family and friends? The opposing party is here with sinful intentions. If the dynasty is destroyed, tradition will dwindle. Women will to be taken advantage of. The dynasty will go to hell. The ancestors will be deprived of sustenance. Why should I commit such an evil act? These are all very good traditional, religious, righteous arguments. But so far, that's all we've talked about. Now we're going to transition from dharma, which is good, to brahm, or gyan, to knowledge. From traditional religious notions to transcendental spiritual ones. Interestingly here, Krishna's last instruction in chapter 18 also ends with do not lament. So the first thing Krishna tells Arjuna as his instructions begin is do not lament. Anushochanti. And the last thing he says is also do not worry or lament. We'll get to that verse at the end. Okay? So the first and last thing are do not worry, which is actually very soothing. It's very relieving. So in 2:12 to 2:30, Krishna begins with his discussion of Sankhya Yoga. This is very important. That's why it's highlighted in blue. Because this chapter is called Sankhya Yoga, so we have to have some Sankhya. And later on, we'll have some Karma Yoga as well. And later on, we'll have some Bhakti Yoga as well. That's why it's called the summary of the entire text. Chapter is called the Yoga of Analysis or Sankhya Yoga, but it includes elements of all three types of yoga. But in 2:12 to 2:30, we will begin with our discussion of yoga, which again, I've said this 10 times. The analytical study of matter and spirit, and the introspection and detachment it gives rise to is Sankhya Yoga. Now, why does Sankhya Yoga give rise to detachment? Because the knowledge that we are different from the material world, that we are eternal and the material world is temporary, curbs our desire to act in the world that does not endure. So the first thing that Krishna says is, look at the people on the other side of the battle. Never was there a time that I Krishna did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor shall any of us cease to exist in the future. Krishna is saying the self or the Atma is not a product of time. It has eternally existed in past, present, and future. There's another reason this verse is so significant, because I'm not going to break down every verse like this. Krishna says that there's never a time where all of us, me, you, and all of these kings will exist. Why is this important? Because there is a philosophical system called Advaita Vedanta, or non-dualism, which essentially argues that the Atma, or the self, and God, or Brahman, are ultimately one and the same. Essentially, we're like a bunch of drops of water. Or actually, this is a better example. Imagine you have an ocean, and within that ocean you have jars of water. What's inside of the jar is water, and what's outside of the jar is also water. And imagine you have 10 of those jars. Those 10 jars represent me, you the viewer, and 8 other people. As soon as the jars are shattered, with a hammer, let's say, the water inside the jar blends with the water in the ocean, and it becomes one. So in reality, the water inside is H2O, and the water outside is H2O. So there's no difference between me, you, and the 8 other people. We're just under this illusion that we exist as separate beings, but once we shatter the glass or the ignorance, we all become one. Krishna disagrees with that. And this is a very prominent philosophy in India for a couple thousand years. Krishna says no. Even in the future, we will all have our individuality. In other words, the plurality of our souls will always exist. Plurality meaning there will always be multiple individual souls, whether they're under illusion in the world or whether they are self-realized and have attained moksha. There will always be multiple. They'll never blend into God and become God. This is a false notion. What is the significance of this? Because Krishna lays the foundation for eternal devotion. Because in order for love to exist between God and his devotee, there has to be 2 people. You can't love yourself. I mean, I suppose you could, but in order for love between 2 parties to exist, there has to be individuality. You have to have preference. You have to have choice. So Krishna begins to lay the foundation for eternal devotion, for the eternal individuality of the self and God. Why? Because the eternal individuality of the self and God is required for reciprocal dealings in loving devotional union. So this is the significance of this chapter, or this verse. The self is not a product of time, it is eternal. And each of us are individual beings, now, before, and always in the future, even if we become enlightened. Okay? So now we're still talking about Sankhya Yoga, the study of matter and spirit. What does Krishna say? Krishna says the self or the Atma will acquire another body after death. Right now I have this body with this black hair and this blue shirt on and this skin color and these glasses and these lips. But after this body dies and decomposes, my Atma, myself, my consciousness, right? Because what did we define in the introductory video? What is the Atma? The Atma is an indivisible unit of pure consciousness. Once the body dies, that Atma will move on into another body after death. Krishna says, happiness and distress are temporary experiences that arise from sense perception. Heat, cold, pleasure, and pain come and go, and you must learn to tolerate them. This is just a little sprinkling of what is going to come in the later chapter. But Krishna is beginning to say, we can't change our experience of the world outside of it. The world is a cruel place. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's painful, and sometimes it's nice. Sometimes it's good temperature, sometimes it's pleasurable. But we must learn to tolerate both extremes. Why? Because one who can tolerate these dualities of the senses, of sense perception, of what do the senses perceive? Things like temperature, things like pleasure, things like pain. One who can tolerate these is wise and eligible for eternal life. So now Krishna is going to talk about Sankhya. He's going to distinguish matter from spirit. What makes matter different from spirit? Well, Krishna says, Nasato vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate sataha. He compares things that are unreal to things that are real. Things that are asat to things that are sat. Means not, just like typical versus atypical. The prefix a negates the meaning of the word. So Krishna begins to compare the unreal from the real. Why? Because Sankhya is comparing matter from spirit. Matter is unreal, spirit is real. What do we say? What do we mean by matter is unreal? It changes. It's never permanent. The body and the world are asat, unreal in the sense that they experience change. I just said that. And the self is sat. Now Krishna is going to further go into Sankhya. He undertakes an analytical study of matter, which is asat, and spirit, which is sat. The sat, the spirit soul or the self, is eternal. It is unborn. It is indestructible, invisible, inconceivable, and unchangeable. For example, can I detect my soul? No, I can't put a microscope. I can see my heart. I can see it pumping blood. I can't see my Atma. Why? It cannot be pierced by weapons. It cannot be burned by fire, moistened by water, or withered by wind. What is the Atma's relationship with the body? Right? Because our self, our soul, our Atma is present within this body. Just as one puts on new clothes after discarding old ones, similarly, the self or the Atma accepts new bodies after discarding the worn out ones. So when I change my clothes tomorrow morning, that is analogous to when I die, I get a new body. My body is not who I am. It's like a pair of clothes. It's the vessel in which I live and exist, in which I am embodied. Now Krishna says, okay, all of these arguments are true, but let's accept for a moment that I'm wrong. Even if we accept for argument's sake that the self is not eternal, if we accept that the Atma is actually non-eternal, that it's asat, if we accept that the Atma is like the body, like the material world, and that it's unreal, he said, so? You should still not lament if the self is continually born and continually dies. Why? Because death is certain for all who take birth. So at some point you're going to die anyways. Right? So even if I was wrong, Krishna's saying, he's being humble here. He said, let's suppose I'm wrong for a moment. You still have every reason to fight. And that is what Krishna's doing. He's trying to give Arjuna every reason to fight. So far he's given the Sankhya Yoga reason. Then he just gave this sort of counter argument. He said, okay, even if it's not eternal, even if the Atma is not eternal, you should still fight. And now in these last few verses of 231 to 237, he's going to say other reasons why Arjuna should fight. The reasons so far are the primary ones, but another reason he tells Arjuna to fight is for dharma. Dharma is socio-religious topics. Arjuna should also fight because he is a warrior, and fighting against injustice is his duty. Now this is important, because previously we said that Krishna's instructions were a transition from dharma to brahm jigyasa or gyan, right? Because religious life is traditional, which is good, but we're talking about spiritual things. Religious life, in many ways, can be very dogmatic. Krishna is coming up with this transformative idea of a spiritual life, not a religious one. And I know that's a bit of a difficult thing to understand. Like, are you saying that you shouldn't be religious? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying religion tends to be very dogmatic. It tends to be very proscriptive and prescriptive. It tells you what to do and what not to do. It tends to prioritize righteous action, which is good. We want a righteous world. But it doesn't give us the antidote to suffering. Spirituality does. Anyways, Krishna says, look, you should fight because the body is temporary and the self is actually eternal. Even if that wasn't the case, you should still fight because death is certain anyways. But also, you're a warrior, and your dharma or duty is to fight against injustice. There are other bad people standing on the other side. It is your duty. If there's people coming to attack you, you should fight them. So he's trying to give Arjun every reason to fight. Now, in 238, so far we've only talked about Sankhya Yoga and then a little bit about Dharma, right? But I told you this chapter has everything. It has Karam Yoga as well. So now we're going to transition. That's why there's a line here. In 238, Krishna says he's going to begin to prime Arjun for the next phase of the chapter about Karam Yoga. He says, considering pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat to be equal, prepare yourself for battle without fear of incurring sin. This is Karam Yoga, right? The first half of this chapter, up until verse 239, is Sankhya Yoga. What is Sankhya Yoga? The analytical study of matter and spirit, right? Because we literally talked about what are the properties of the Atma, what are the properties of the material world, right? Right? The Atma is eternal, unborn, indestructible, indivisible, inconceivable, unchangeable, etc. Krishna is now going to start on Karam Yoga. So the first half of chapter 2 is Sankhya Yoga. Second half is Karam Yoga. And within that second half about Karam Yoga, Krishna includes a bunch of other things, including Bhakti Yoga. Because in its mature state, when selfless action is done as an offering to God, it becomes Bhakti Yoga. So anyways, Karam Yoga is performing action without being attached to the results, right? So that means whether the result is pleasure or pain, gain or loss, victory or defeat, we should perform action, and that is Karam Yoga. So Krishna is preparing to talk about that, right? So he says, Sukh dukkhe same kritva labh alabho jaya jayo. Sukh, pleasure, dukh, pain, same kritva, be the same. Labh means gain, alabh means loss, jay or vijay means victory, and ajay or parajay means defeat. Okay? So this is the most important verse right now. Krishna just talked about 239, or talked about Sankhya Yoga, and now he's going to talk about Karam Yoga. And I told you another term for Karam Yoga is Buddhi Yoga, right? And this is very important. The reason I literally put this verse here is because Krishna says, I just told you about Sankhya. You see this word right here? Now let me tell you about Buddhi Yoga. You see? And interestingly, Krishna doesn't say Sankhya Yoga here. He just says Sankhya. Because, and this is interesting, when the word Sankhya is used alone, it means Sankhya. But when the word yoga is used alone, because there are three types of yoga, Karam Yoga, Sankhya Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. Karam Yoga, Sankhya Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. When the word yoga is used alone, it refers automatically to Karam Yoga. So it's like there's a little parenthesis here. Does that make sense? Krishna said, I just told you about Sankhya Yoga. Now let me tell you about Buddhi Yoga. This is very critical. I hope you understand this. That's why I put such an effort into distinguishing between these two types of yoga. Okay? Krishna concludes his discussion of Sankhya Yoga, which is discerning between the body and the self so that detachment can awaken, and begins his discussion of Buddhi Yoga or Karam Yoga. Although Arjun is a warrior, the dharma that Krishna is asking Arjun to perform is Karam Yoga with the goal of freeing himself from bondage resulting from karma. Right? Krishna briefly talked about doing dharma in terms of like duty as a warrior, but Krishna is saying your real duty is to become detached, and that from action, or from the fruits of action. And detachment from the fruits or results of action is Karam Yoga. And the benefit is that you don't experience any karma. And we talked about this in the Satyanarayan intro. What is karma? The results of your action. So you're not bound, badham, or bandham. Sorry. means to be bound. So you won't be bound to karam, or results, success or failure, if you perform action with a spirit of detachment. Okay. Now, interestingly, we've had this transition now from Sankhya Yoga to Karam Yoga. Now Krishna is going to mount a critique against the Vedas. This is very transformative. I mean, tell me, in any religious system where there is a critique internally, Krishna is going to critique the Vedas. The Vedas are the supreme most texts of the Sanatan or Hindu tradition, right? Why? Krishna says, those interested in traditional religious life, which the Vedas are arguing for, are driven by the desire for opulence, Aishwarya, and material enjoyment, Bhog. Okay? He says, such people of meager intelligence proclaim that the flowery words of the Vedas are all in all. Because the Vedas are very complex. They are these ancient texts written in a form of Sanskrit that is much more difficult than the Sanskrit in this Gita. They are supposed to be read by Brahmins or Pandits, Purohits, right? Krishna is saying that the people who are actually thinking that that is the supremest knowledge are misunderstanding. They're very dogmatic because they are missing the point of the Vedas. They take delight in the letter of the law, right? If maybe you've heard this phrase, the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law, right? The letter of the law is like literally interpreting a text word for word, mechanically, exactly by what it means. The spirit of the law is the people who wrote this had a particular intention, and therefore we shouldn't interpret it literally, right? Sometimes there's some room for negotiation, right? For example, the letter of the law is it's wrong to hurt anyone, right? Now, if you interpret that literally every single time, if someone comes to your door and tries to attack you, you wouldn't hurt them because you've been told it's wrong to hurt someone. The spirit of that idea that it's wrong to hurt someone is that as long as no one else is hurting you, you shouldn't hurt them. But if they are going to hurt you, then you can defend yourself, right? And the point of that analogy is most people are in that party of people who believes in the letter of the law. They believe in these traditional ritualistic ideas, but they don't understand their deeper meaning. Just like someone who says it's wrong to hurt someone doesn't understand the deeper meaning that if someone comes to attack you, you should defend yourself. Such people are of meager intelligence. People are saying the people who think that the Vedas are the ultimate goal of life, all in all, are actually not that intelligent. They're meager intelligent. They take delight in the letter of the Vedic law, saying there's nothing more than this. They're full of desires for opulence, Ishvarya, and material enjoyment, and think that attaining heaven or Swargalok, or a good birth in the next life, Janma Karma Phal, is desirable. Thus they remain attached to ritualistic performance. This is an internal critique of Hinduism. Who does this? Which author of a text critiques his own previous writings? Krishna is saying that people don't actually understand the purpose of the Vedas. Right? Many religious traditions are very ritualistic. They are entitled to that. And rituals, there's nothing wrong with them, but we should understand the deeper meaning behind them. If rituals are performed for ritual's sake, because we want something, right? If we go performing rituals just because we desire opulence and material enjoyment, that is not very intelligent. Right? So what does Krishna say? He's mounting a critique against the Vedas. He's saying that the Vedas have this flowery language that most people get too attached to, and they don't understand the deeper meaning behind it. Right? And Krishna says, such desires for material opulence and sense enjoyment must be curbed if we are to make spiritual progress. Okay? Very significant verse. Probably I would say it's among the top 5 most significant verses in this chapter. Bhogeshvarya prasakta nam tyapaharta chetasam vyavasyatmika buddhi samado na vidhiyate. Krishna literally ends this verse with, these people who are reading the Vedas are after opulence and material enjoyment. Krishna says, you should give that up. Exact same word or phrase, Bhogeshvarya. Bhog means desire, and Ishwarya means opulence. You have to give up material desire, or at least quell it, put it down a bit, lower it, so that we can make spiritual progress. Because otherwise you'll just be chasing things in the material world. Why? Why is Krishna critiquing the Vedas? Traigunya Vishaya Veda. The Vedas deal with life in the three modes of material nature. We talked about this a little bit in the introduction. Material nature is called Prakriti. There are three modes: the mode of goodness, the mode of passion, the mode of ignorance. Okay? Goodness is Satagun, or Sattva. Passion is Rajas, and ignorance is Tamas. Right? We can perform actions in an ignorant way, in a passionate way, or in a good way. Krishna is saying is that the Vedas deal with these three modes of nature. Interestingly, Krishna says the mode of goodness is not enough. It might be better than the mode of ignorance. But we must transcend all three modes and become free from concern of acquisition and comfort. So now you might have this question. So why then do the Vedas and notions of religious life even exist? Krishna's critiquing the Vedas, so then why do the Vedas exist? Why do traditional religious ideas exist? Is that bad? No. Here's why. And this is a quote from the commentary of Swami Tripurari. The sections of the Vedas dealing with material advancement, which make up the greater balance or the majority of the text, are for the general people who are full of material desires. Right? Most people have material desires. They spend their entire lives chasing the bag, chasing enjoyment. So the Vedas exist because rituals prescribed in the Vedas seek to regulate desires bringing about religious life. Essentially, people can pursue these desires in a hedonistic, uncontrolled way. The Vedas say no. If you have desires, those desires should be done in a controlled context with a specific purpose and as a sacrifice or a rite. And because of that, there are some rituals that are helpful. Furthermore, these rituals and these Vedas awaken faith in their words in those who practice them. Right? So it's better to be at that level of being religious from a traditional point of view, because the fruit of this subsequent faith is that in time it causes people to look more deeply into the scripture. The Vedas have a very materialistic part called Karam Kand, which deal with action and tradition and ritual. But the Vedas also have a deeper part. Okay? And if you perform certain actions in a religious and traditional context and in a dharmic way, then over time you'll become purified and you will have faith in the text and you will look more deeply in your scripture and you'll learn after looking more deeply about the spiritual life as opposed to religious life. Right? We talked about religious life. Dharma is good. Who says dharma is bad? Dharma is excellent, but there's a level of bhav dharma, or traditional dogmatic religious ritualistic life, spiritual life, Brahma Jigyasa, Sankhya, Gyan. Okay? Now Krishna gives a well analogy. Why should we transcend the three modes? Right? Why is Krishna critiquing the Vedas? Because the Vedas are like a small well of water, and performing Karam Yoga is like an ocean. In other words, the rituals in the Vedas can only give limited results, whereas Karam Yoga is oceanic in its outreach and depth of spiritual possibility. And whatever one can attain through the Vedas and other paths can be attained through Karam Yoga with less effort. In other words, one who realizes God experiences all the bliss available through Vedic ritual and more. Right? A well only has a limited amount of water. That water is really hard to extract. You have to get a bucket and put it in. Isn't it easier to just go to the ocean? So Krishna's saying is if you want water, you can go to the Vedas, you'll get it. It's difficult to access, but you'll still get your water. But if you want pure water in abundance, with so much possibility, go to the ocean. Krishna's saying the path that I'm telling you is like an ocean. And traditional religious conceptions are like a well. It's better to have water than to be in a desert without water. It's better to have some religion or some tradition guiding your actions so that you're righteous, but it's better to transcend that. And there's a path above that called Karam Yoga. Okay? Now finally, this is the last section because we're almost at the hour mark, so we should get to actually reading the text. Krishna's going to do a formal discussion of Karam Yoga. We've talked so much about Sankhya Yoga, right? Previously, all these aspects of Sankhya Yoga. Now we're going to talk about Karam Yoga. Krishna gives two definitions of Karam Yoga. First one in 248. Karam Yoga is equanimity of mind. It is performing your actions without being attached to the results. Whether you experience success or failure, if you are not attached to the results, that is Karam Yoga. Right? Krishna says that action performed in 249 for results, which is called Karam. Not Karam Yoga. Karam is action done for results. Karam yoga is action done without a desire for the results. Karam is inferior to action done without a desire for the results, which is called Karam yoga buddhi yoga for the 15th time. Why? Because Karam yoga is the art of work. Ordinary work, or karam, which is work done with attachment for the results, creates karam. Remember I said when you were reading this that karma or karam has two definitions. It is both action and the result of action. Krishna is saying that ordinary action creates more action. It creates outcomes which you have to experience. Right? If you perform action with an attachment to the results, the success and failure that you get, the karam that you sow, you'll have to reap later on. You reap what you sow. But karam yoga, action done without a desire for the results, gets rid of good and bad karma altogether and does not create any new karma. What is the significance of this? We talked about how in 251, those who perform karam yoga are freed from the bondage of rebirth, sansara, and attain liberation or moksha. The issue with karam is even if you perform action with attachment to the results, in the mode of goodness, right? Krishna said the three modes of material nature. If you do something with a spirit of goodness, the issue is that it binds you. You still have to enjoy the results. You still have to be in this world. But if you want to transcend this world and get peace within this world, actually, and never experience suffering, you have to perform action without being attached to the results. And that's very difficult, and we'll get into that. It's very difficult, but what makes it easy is when Karam Yoga matures, again, into Bhakti Yoga. Remember this little part I had? Pause this. Karam Yoga is performing action selflessly without a desire for the results. That's very difficult. But when that same action is done without a desire for the results, but also as an offering to God, Karam Yoga and Bhakti Yoga become one. Karam Yoga becomes one element of a broader umbrella of Bhakti Yoga. Okay? Let's quickly finish this up. So the second definition of Karam is that it's the art of work. So Krishna literally says, this is literally the definition of Karam Yoga. 248, 250. Write that down. Those who perform Karam Yoga are freed from sansara and attain liberation. Now Krishna critiques the Vedas again. The Vedas, by the way, are also called Shruti. He compares them to a dense, perplexing forest. He says the Vedas advocate for rituals and actions motivated by a desire for material gain. Let's zoom out. Why is Krishna repeatedly critiquing the Vedas or traditional religious life? He's not just critiquing the Vedas, he's critiquing religious systems in general. Why? Because religion advocates for righteous behavior, and this is certainly a good thing. We don't want people to be unrighteous, but religion stops there usually. It often does not give us an antidote to suffering, and Krishna is trying to do that by helping us transcend religion into spirituality. Now, Arjuna asked Krishna about the characteristics of a devotee. Krishna has so far spoken so broadly about Sankhya Yoga, about Karam Yoga, which we've just, given two definitions of. Now Arjuna is asking, okay, you're telling me all these fancy terms, but what are the characteristics of someone who has practiced them, of a yogi? How do they speak? How do they sit? And how do they move? This is very significant. When Krishna is saying sitting, he's saying it, or when Arjuna is talking about sitting, how do they sit? It's both literal and metaphorical. Sitting is like if you're sitting down and meditating, and moving is like you're not meditating. But sitting also means withdrawing from the world, and moving means interacting with the world. So Krishna is saying, how do they speak? How do they withdraw from the world? But also they have to be part of it. So how do they interact with it? Right? You can go and meditate in a forest, which is Sankhya Yoga, but Krishna wants Arjuna to fight. So Arjuna is saying, you want me to fight, but you also want me to be detached from the result while fighting. So how can I interact with the world? Krishna first says that freedom from desire, passion, fear, and anger are symptoms of a yogi. Now, this is perhaps the most significant section of the entire chapter. So significant, it's in orange. Remember, I told you what the highlights mean. Blue, pink, orange. Blue, pink, orange. We've talked about Sankhya Yoga, path of detachment based upon the discernment between the body and the self, which causes us to curb our desire to act in the world and perform any action. We've talked about Karam Yoga, which is the path of selfless action. Now we're going to talk about Bhakti Yoga, which is when that Karam Yoga is matured and becomes a path of selfless action, which is now offered to God. Everything that Krishna has spoken about being free from desire, passion, fear, and anger, that seems impossible. I mean, at the end of the day, we're human, right? It is very difficult to give up material attachments because when we try, our taste for them still remains. Like imagine you have some cake that someone just brought home. Imagine how hard it is to resist that cake. Our brain is repeatedly firing off, telling us that, no, I want that sugar. It's very hard to give it up. Krishna says that it's only possible in one way, if we have a higher taste, something more alluring, something that can make it easy for us to give up material attachments, right? Like someone who drinks a Coke a day, which has real sugar, it's easy to give up a Coke a day if you have Diet Coke, right, with Splenda or some artificial sugar. It's hard to give up a Coke altogether, right? Imagine you drink 10 Cokes a day, and now someone's asking you to drink water. It's very hard to do. If you want to become healthy, it's better to replace those Cokes with Diet Cokes, because now you're not getting all the sugar, which causes those, which sugar has a very high glycemic index, right? It causes those sugar spikes, which obviously can lead to diabetes. It's very hard to give up material attachments. We need a higher taste. We need a replacement. We need Splenda. We can't enjoy sugar. We want sugar, but we need Splenda. Something more alluring. Something higher. And once we look at the Sanskrit, that higher taste is a padam drishtva. Padam drishtva. Padam indicates something supreme. And taste, it means drishtva. One who develops a taste for the supreme is able to forego the taste for sense indulgence. And what is that supreme thing that is like the Diet Coke, which can make it easy for us to give up the Coke, to give up material enjoyment? Direct experience of God is required to retire the taste for material life. Does that make sense? So that is Bhakti Yoga. Krishna is saying, you're right. Performing selfless action, which is Karam Yoga, action without attachment to the results, is very difficult. If you do that action as an offering to me, if you connect with me, which is now Bhakti Yoga, you're still performing action selflessly, but it's an offering to God. Now, that is Bhakti Yoga. And now Krishna, this is a very significant verse. Krishna answers Arjun's question from 254. Arjun said, how does a yogi speak, sit, and move? Krishna says, a yogi, someone who is self-realized, who is enlightened, restrains their senses and sits. They sit, fixing their consciousness on me to experience this higher taste. This is the sum and conclusion of the entire Gita. Right here, that's why this chapter, although it's called Sankhya Yoga, the yoga of analysis, is also called the summary of the content of the Gita, because every form of yoga is mentioned here. And interestingly, Krishna uses the first person here. He says, Mam. They fix their consciousness on me. He doesn't say they fix their consciousness on some abstract form of God. Remember in the introduction we talked about this notion that about this dilemma about whether God is a person or an abstract esoteric force, right? Is God a person, or is he just the universe, this abstract animating force in the universe? Krishna literally uses the first person here. He says they fix their consciousness on me, meaning that Krishna with the blue Shama skin, with the flute in hand, the peacock feather. He uses the first person. And many people purposely skip out on this. They'll say, no, Krishna is just talking about God, this esoteric force that exists in the universe. And they purposely misinterpret the Gita and dilute the Gita of its sweetness, of its essence of bhakti and devotion. You can't be devoted to some esoteric force in the universe. That is also an aspect of God, remember? We talked about it. Krishna is like the sun, which has a form, which has a mass. And from that Krishna with a form, there are photons. Photons are massless, formless particles that are emitted. In one sense, the photon is non-different than the sun. Similarly, Krishna has a form, and from that form is emitted a formless version of God. But Krishna is not saying to meditate on that formless version of God, which you can certainly do. People do that, and Krishna will talk about that approach later on in the text. He's using the first person for a very specific reason. He says, giving up material attachments is hard. You need a higher taste, something more alluring. Just like if you want to give up Coke, you need Diet Coke. To get that higher taste, you can meditate on me in the first person. Devote your actions to me. Perform them selflessly, but as an offering to me. Karam Yoga becomes Bhakti Yoga. That's beautiful. That is the essence of the Gita. That is the essence of this chapter. Everything we've said so far is important, but if I want anything to be taken away, pause the video now and just write this down. It is hard to give up material attachments because we need a higher taste. Krishna is that higher taste, and when we perform actions selflessly as an offering to God, Gadam Yoga matures into Bhakti Yoga. Okay? Now, 262 to 263, Krishna is going to summarize all of Vedic psychology. He's basically going to say that desire is the root cause of suffering. This is an incredibly important, like when we talk about Vedic psychology, traditional notions of religion, right? The Buddhists have this idea that suffering is bad. The same idea or suffering is caused by desire. Excuse me. Krishna goes and says that exactly here. I'm not going to read this because I'm going to read it later. Krishna says, when one contemplates the sense objects, when you contemplate things, attachment for them develops. When you become attached, you're very desired. You're lusty for them. From desire, if that desire isn't fulfilled, you become frustrated. Or if it is fulfilled, you'll always want more. And you can't infinitely get more, so you'll be frustrated even then. When you're frustrated, you become deluded. Your mind is under an illusion. When you're under illusion, you forget what is right. You forget. You forget your knowledge. When you forget knowledge, your power of discrimination is destroyed. You can't tell right from wrong. Krishna said, what is discrimination? The ability to tell right from wrong, to distinguish sat from asat, to distinguish the self or the atma from the body, to distinguish the eternal from the temporary. That power of discrimination or discernment or distinguishment is destroyed. And as soon as that ability to tell right from wrong is destroyed, you completely destroy yourself. Yourself is lost. Again, we're going to come back to a bhakti topic. However, even while moving among the sense objects, it's very difficult to give up sense objects, right? Krishna is saying that as soon as you contemplate something, attachment is born, and if you follow the natural progression, this is like a mathematical equation, right? As soon as you think of something, the ultimate result is that you're destroyed. That's very difficult. So wouldn't the better approach then to just be to meditate in a forest? Forget about all the things that are disturbing your senses and are attracting. You just go meditate in a forest? No. Why? Because, however, even while moving amongst the sense objects, the self-controlled one who is free from attachment and aversion, who brings himself under the jurisdiction of God, attains God's grace. It's beautiful. Meaning you can't artificially give up desires. You can't artificially give up Coke. You need a higher taste. You need Diet Coke. You need to meditate on Krishna. And if you do that, if you do your action, Gadam Yoga, as an offering to God, which is now Bhakti Yoga, now you attain God's grace. Christianity has a very similar notion, right? The idea of faith versus works, right, which is central to the distinction between Protestantism and Catholicism. Very similar notion here. As soon as we transform Gadam Yoga into Bhakti Yoga by doing our action as an offering to God, we attain God's grace. And now, we're not depending on our own strength to resist the Coca-Cola, to resist the material objects, because that's difficult. We can't do it on our own strength. But if we surrender to God and do our actions as an offering to God, now all of God's strength becomes ours. All of His grace becomes ours, and we can do the impossible. That's why these three sections, 259, 261, 264, are the hints of Bhakti Yoga in chapter 2, which is called Sankhya Yoga, and thus chapter 2, for the 10th time, is also called the summary of the contents of the Gita, because we've talked about Sankhya Yoga, Gadam Yoga, and how Gadam Yoga can become Bhakti Yoga. As a result of this, when you have God's grace, when you're not attached to the results of your action, when you do action as an offering to God, you no longer experience suffering. You become peaceful. Right? But the first step to attaining this peace, to get God's grace, is to control our senses, to control our mind and become detached. The first thing we have to, you can't just become detached artificially. The first thing you have to do is you have to control your senses. You eat too much, that's gluttony. You eat in moderation. You speak too much, control your senses. You're attracted to some particular object, be cautious. Next, Krishna gives a beautiful analogy. He says, this path that I've talked about is very difficult. And he gives a day and night analogy. He says, the interest of those who are spiritually awakened and want to follow my path is like day. And the people who don't want to follow this path, who are spiritually asleep, they're the opposite. They're like night. The interests, the things we pursue, whether we're spiritually awakened or spiritually asleep, are opposite, like day and night. Right? These are very difficult things to do. if we come at it from a traditional angle. There's like a day and night difference between what normal life is like and what is being proposed here. There's a day and night difference between a spiritual life and a non-spiritual life. It's very different. So what is the result? All suffering stops. If you act without a desire for results, or at least do your actions as an offering to God while being in this world, then you will attain peace in this lifetime and liberation from all suffering after death, meaning in the hereafter, in the thereafter. And this suffering after and this liberation after death is called Brahma Nirvanam, which is very significant because the word nirvana is a distinctly Buddhist term, which usually refers to the absence of all suffering. Krishna will use this word nirvana again 3 times in the 5th chapter. However, the absence of suffering alone, which is nirvana, is like a default colorless state. Like imagine you're sick and all of a sudden you're no longer sick. That's like nirvana, you're no longer sick. But the fact that you're no longer sick doesn't mean that you're healthy and that you're thriving, right? The lack of disease does not mean good health. Similarly, the lack of all suffering is not our goal. That is nirvana. But Krishna says Brahma Nirvana. It's not just that we want all suffering to end, because that is just a default colorless state. It's like going from -10 to 0. Now we want to go into positive numbers. It's like going from sick, think about this. Let's use this actually, because we're at the bottom. Sick, non-sick, healthy. Negative number, 0, positive number. Material life, nirvana, Brahma Nirvana. Krishna is saying that just because we end all suffering, we don't want that. We want more than that. The word Brahma here implies that this state of 0 suffering is also full of bliss. And how is it full of bliss? Because you have love for Krishna. Okay? This is a lot. We're an hour and 15 minutes in. We haven't even touched the text. But because of all of this, you'll 100% understand. This is just an hour and 15 minutes of your time. You'll 100% understand everything else with such precision. You'll be impressed and happy with yourself that you've come this far, that you've realized this much. Okay. A few more things, some quick notes, and some notable verses. In the first chapter, we talked about some notable verses, 4 of them, or 4 sets of them, 5 verses, or 6 verses actually. Yeah. Here, because chapter 2 is a summary of the Gita, I hate to do this, but there are so many notable verses, many of which can be memorized and should be memorized. For other chapters, I promise I won't put such an exhaustive list of significant verses, but this chapter just has so many because it's a summary of the content of the Gita. So therefore, we'll cover this at the end, but now let us quickly go and read the text. Okay? Chapter 2 is called the Yoga of Analysis. Krishna begins saying, Sanjay said, to Arjuna, who was thus overcome with pity and had tears filling his downcast eyes in despair, Madhusudan began to speak. Okay? Why? The previous chapter is called Vishada Yoga. Vishada is a condition of distress. The symptoms of Arjuna's distress in the form of downcast eyes filled with tears are described in this verse in the course of introducing Krishna's speech. Interestingly, the grammatical arrangement in this verse indicates that Arjuna's despair is external and thus possible to remove. Krishna's instruction in this chapter constitute a summary of the Gita. Now, when Arjuna dropped his bow at the end of the previous chapter, having spoken thus, Arjuna sat down on his chariot and cast aside his bow and arrows, his heart overcome with grief. Dhritarashtra's heart leaped. Remember, who is Dhritarashtra? Dhritarashtra is Arjuna's uncle. He is the father of Duryodhana, who is on the other side as the enemy. Dhritarashtra is the blind king who says the first verse of the Gita, Dharma kshetra kurukshetra samavetaya yutsavaha mamaka pandava sheva kimakurvata Sanjaya. The old king thought, despite Sanjay's subtle inferences to the contrary, it appears that I was right. The piety of the Pandavas and that of the Kurukshetra have combined to grant victory to my son by default. Arjuna won't fight, and Duryodhana will be the king without shooting an arrow. Sensing his false hopes, Sanjay continues his narration, relating how Krishna, whom he addresses here as Madhusudan, begins to speak. He refers to Krishna by his name, by the name Madhusudan, to indicate to Dhritarashtra that just as Krishna had long before slain the demon Madhu, so now he would slay the demon-like doubts of Arjuna. Because remember, every time a different form of Krishna's name is used, Govinda, Janardhan, Madhusudan, it's an epithet, it has a meaning. Madhusudan was a title given to Krishna because he killed a demon named Madhu to to bring the Vedas back, to save the Vedas. So similarly, just like he slayed the demon, he will slay Arjun's doubts. So that's why those doubts are compared to demons. The Lord of Shri said, the Lord of Shri is Krishna, Arjun, from where has this faint-heartedness come at the hour of fighting? It is not befitting a man of your character, an Aryan. It does not lead to heaven or good reputation. Okay, now this is significant. Why is Krishna here referred to as the Lord of Shri? In the previous section, or the previous verse, we just said that Krishna is referred to as Madhusudan because he slayed the demon Madhu, and similarly, he will slay Arjun's doubts. Here, Krishna is referred to as Bhagavan, which, if you're Indian, you've probably heard. It's a very common title given to Krishna. Bhagavan means this: he whose nature is such that whoever comes in touch with him cannot resist feeling moved to worship and adore his charming personality. Bhagavan also means one who possesses wealth, strength, beauty, fame, knowledge, and renunciation in full. This is very interesting. Just a quick other meaning of Bhagavan, because remember, every epithet has a meaning. One commentator, Jeev Goswami, says that the in the syllable va. Actually, no, where do we want to go? Let's see. Here. Bhagavan. Pa represents bharta, which implies the power to nourish or maintain. Krishna possesses the power to maintain and nourish the devotees. Ga. We just said pa. Now we're going to do ga. Stands for gamyata. Gamayayata. It means he who has the power to grant love of God or bring God's devotees to his abode. Va stands for the verb vas, which means to reside. Bhagavan is he in whom everything resides, and he who resides in the hearts of his devotees. Just a little cool factoid right there. So Krishna dismisses all of Arjun's arguments. Right? He says, where is this? Remember Arjun had all those arguments in the first chapter, which we just talked about in our little summary? Where does this faint-heartedness come from? Krishna calls Arjun's symptoms of fear faint-heartedness in response to Arjun's 5-verse speech about winning and losing kingdoms and nobility in the previous chapter. Go back to the video in chapter 1 if you missed it. Krishna tells Arjun that while speaking about that which is noble, his speech is not befitting a noble person, an Aryan. To Arjun's 5 verses concerning not acting disgracefully, Krishna replies that he has attracted infamy. So Krishna is literally answering all of Arjun's verses, doubts surgically and dismantling them. And to Arjun's concerns about attaining heaven, Krishna tells him his speech will not lead him there. Asvargyam. Arjun is thus shattered by Krishna's opening remarks, which are followed by Krishna's remedial measures. Therefore, O son of Pritha, which is a title for Arjun, do not yield to impotency, for it is not becoming. O chastiser of enemies, cast off this petty weakness of heart. Stand up and fight. Now, why does Krishna refer to Arjun as Pritha? Right? We just said why Krishna is referred to as Bhagavan, why he's referred to as Madhusudan. Why is Arjun given the name Pritha? Why? Because Pritha is the name of Arjun's mother, and it's Krishna is trying to point out the fact that Arjun is Pritha's son, and his father is Indra, the king of heaven and a powerful warrior. A great warrior like Arjun should not yield to impotency, which is superficial and springs from weakness of heart. So he's saying, you're the son of the king of heaven. Don't be so weak. And Krishna is being a little harsh here in his tone. Arjun says, O killer of the demon Madhu, how can I kill in battle Bhishma, Tama, and Drona? How can I use arrows against these two worshipable men, O killer of enemies? Right? Because what? Krishna is expecting Arjun to kill his gurus, who are worthy of his worship. Yet Arjun is expected to throw arrows at them rather than flowers. Arjun is thinking, you kill your enemies, but when have you killed your friends and teachers, right? Would you ever think of doing so? You call my reluctance weakness of heart? Arjun is shocked. He's saying, how are you calling me weak, Krishna? I'm saying I don't want to kill my teachers, harm them. I don't want to do it. I should worship them. Arjun said, it is better to live in this world as a beggar than to live at the cost of the lives of my venerable elders. If these respectable elders are killed, the spoils will be tainted with blood. It's a little interesting fact. I would have you pause this and read it. I don't want to do that now just because of time. And in this verse, like I said before, the meter changes from the Anushtubh meter to the Trishtubh meter, which is the Kshatriya meter. This change of meter indicates the heightened emotion of Arjun. Arjun is very nervous. Now Arjun says, I no longer know which is better, conquering or being conquered. If I kill the sons of Dhritarashtra who are standing before me, I shall not care to live. So here Arjun's bewilderment peaks. He does not know what to do. However, in the midst of this bewilderment, he expresses a conviction that material life is futile. Whether he wins or loses, he sees no prospect. Thus, he demonstrates his eligibility for approaching his guru. Arjun does not know what is best. He's showing very selfless motives. He doesn't want to conquer or hurt his enemy. This is significant. In the first chapter, Arjun demonstrates his qualification for sitting at the feet of the guru. In verse 31 of chapter 1, Arjun exhibits knowledge of the difference between the permanent and the impermanent by saying that he sees no ultimate good in killing. And in the next few verses, he demonstrates dispassion for material gain. He says, I don't want to conquer, I don't want to enjoy this kingdom, both in this life and the next. In verse 43, he shows an understanding of the difference between the body and soul when he acknowledges the soul's potential plight in hell. In verse 32, he displays both internal shama and external dhamma control. He exhibits an absence of greed in verse 38 of chapter 1 and shows tolerance in verse 46. So tracing the underlying eligibility of Arjun, Madhusudhan Saraswati, who was a scholar, sees the first chapter's purpose as indicating the discipline necessary for discipleship. Right? So just let me put that in my own words. Thematically, chapter 1 is about despair, and with it how the potential for transformation arises, and also the qualifications for divine knowledge, the adhikar. The only reason that Arjun is going to be successful in this battle is because he has surrendered to Krishna. He doesn't know what to do. He has questions, and therefore he's eligible to get knowledge from a teacher. If you have all the questions, then go. But if you don't have questions, then seek someone who does. Very significant. Arjun says, Shishyasteham shadi mam tvam prapannam. I'm confused about my duty due to miserly weakness. Therefore, please tell me what is best for me. I am your disciple, a soul surrendered unto you. Please instruct me. What is a miser? A miser is a person who hoards wealth and refuses to spend money, often living in a wretched or stingy condition to avoid dipping into their savings. The reason the word miserly is used here, karpanya, is because Arjun has all of the knowledge. He's so well read, he's such a powerful warrior, yet he doesn't know what to do with that knowledge. In other words, a miser is someone who has so much wealth, so much power, but they're too cheap to actually use it. Arjun has all of this knowledge, all of this righteousness, but he can't use it properly. Right? But now, he's surrendered unto Krishna, and he's asking for instructions. And therefore, knowledge will come to him. Knowledge will flow. He says, even if I were to gain the entire earth as an uncontested kingdom or sovereignty in heaven, I do not see how I could remove the grief that is drying up the power of my senses. Arjun is saying I could gain everything, be the most powerful person in the world, but I would still be so sad because everyone whom I love is dead. He's very selfless here. Sanjay said, thus Godakesh said to Rishikesh, O Govinda, I shall not fight, and fell silent. So Arjun surrenders to Krishna as a guru, speaks about how much in grief he is, and again, just like he had thrown the bow down here, he sat on his chariot, cast aside his bow and arrows, his heart overcome with grief. Krishna tried to console him by being a little harsh, which is good, because sometimes a teacher or a parent has to be a little harsh. Tough love, right? Arjun still is not convinced, because he's so grief-stricken. He says, I shall not fight, and fell silent. And because he is silent, he doesn't have the answer, and he surrendered to Krishna. Now knowledge can flow. O king, in the midst of both armies, Rishikesh, which is a name for Krishna, smiling, spoke these words to the sorrowful Arjun. Why does Krishna smile? To encourage Arjun. Right? Similarly, when we have a very difficult task, sometimes our teacher makes light of the task at the beginning by allowing us to believe that perfection is almost within our grasp. Sometimes when we have a teacher or a parent, they make us optimistic. They give us hope. Krishna is smiling because he was a little harsh before, but now he wants to give Arjun hope. Why does he want to give Arjun hope? Because as Arjun's guru, because Arjun has surrendered, Krishna is Arjun's dearmost friend, and he teaches his disciple like a friendly elder, and that's why he's smiling. He says, "I was being a little rough with you before. Krishna was being a little harsh in his words by calling Arjun weak. Now he's not going to do that." Right? And Arjun has demonstrated, even in his apparent confusion, that he is well versed in the religious codes. Arjun is very, very righteous. He has surpassed inquiry into religious life. Remember I talked about this in the first hour of this video, the difference between dharma and Brahma Jigyasa. He knows well the futility of pursuing happiness in this world, even when one's efforts are in concert with the religious injunctions. He's saying, look, I'll be successful, but everyone I love will be dead, and so I'll be sad. So he's being very right? He's thinking about it through the lens of dharma. But now, with verse 10 and into 11, we're going to go from dharma to jnana. Because even in despair, Arjuna shows detachment. Now we begin Krishna's instructions. While speaking learned word, Krishna says, learned words, you lament for those not worthy of lamentation. The wise lament neither for the living nor the dead. These two verses mark the beginning and end of Krishna's instructions to Arjuna. In both verses, Krishna instructs, don't lament, don't worry. I said this before. At the end of the 18th chapter, Krishna says, Masacha. The last thing that Krishna tells Arjuna is don't worry. The first thing he tells Arjuna now is don't worry. Right? Because he loves his devotee and his friend, and he wants to be optimistic. Krishna says, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor shall any of us cease to exist in the future. And I explained this in the beginning of the video. Go back if you need to. What is the significance of this? He's saying that the self is eternal and not a product of time, and also that we are all individuals that will always exist. The plurality, the fact that there are multiple selves, multiple atmas, me, you, and the viewer, and the other viewers, that will always exist. Right? Even if we attain liberation, our individuality won't be stripped from us. Does that make sense? And so, Arjuna might question how it is that the self can be different from the body, when experience appears to indicate that when the body dies, so too does the soul. Krishna addresses this misperception with the following example from our common experience. Just as the embodied soul experiences changes of body, such as childhood, adulthood, and old age, so similarly it will acquire another body after death. Wise persons are not deluded about this change. And so essentially Krishna is giving Arjuna reasons why he should not lament the battle that lies ahead. Why? Because the Atma, or the self, acquires another body after death. Krishna implies that no one laments when a child's body is replaced by an adult body, nor do they cry when an adult body changes into an old age body. Even if some do lament in this latter case, Bhishma, Pitama, and Dronacharya, once they're defeated, upon dying in battle, will get young bodies. They'll be born again. Which, of course, that's not what actually happens, because Bhishma, Pitama, and Dronacharya are great devotees of Krishna, and just like Arjuna, they've been put under a mystic sleep. Remember we talked about this in chapter 1? They've been put under this mystic divine illusion so that this battle can take place and this lesson can be learned and this conversation can be had. So therefore, either from the material or spiritual point of view, Arjuna has no cause to lament. Even so, Arjuna's mind is disturbed due to it being attached to sense objects, namely Bhishma, Pitama, and Dronacharya, in the form of his relatives' bodies. Thus, Krishna next distinguishes the self from the subtle/mental emotional body. Right? So the self is the Atma. We just talked about the body, which is called the Sharir. Now we're going to talk about the subtle mental or emotional body. In other words, the mind. Right? Krishna says, O son of Kunti, happiness and distress are temporary experiences that arise from sense perception. Heat, cold, pleasure, and pain come and go, and you must learn to tolerate them. Indeed, one who tolerates these dualities of sense perception, such a wise person to whom happiness and unhappiness are thus the same, is eligible for eternal life of self-realization. O best among men. Now this is that famous shlok that I mentioned. Nasato vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate sataha. So Sankhya Yoga is what? We talked about this extensively. Sankhya Yoga is the following. The idea of discerning between that which is temporary and that which is eternal. That which is the body and that which is the self, the Atma. Does that make sense? So in that first category of asat, we have things that are temporary. The body is an example. On the other side, we have the category of sat, things that are eternal, such as the self or the atma. So Krishna is going to say, he's going to describe this. Nasato vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate sataha. That which is subject to change is not eternal or ultimately real. Okay, the body is asat. That which is real is neither temporary nor subject to change. The self is sat. It cannot be destroyed. This is the conclusion the seers of truth reached after deliberating on both. Here Krishna cites the vision of the seers. He does so in appropriately abstract Upanishadic language. What this means is Krishna is Arjun's guru now, right? But at the same time, he's citing great scholars, right? Krishna is saying that there's great people who have seen the ultimate truth. And I'm just citing, what they've experienced, which is the truth. And what are the Upanishads? The Upanishads, so there's the Vedas, right? Which remember Krishna is going to critique. The Vedas have multiple sections. The final section of each Veda, and there are 4 Vedas, is called an Upanishad. It is like the philosophically dense ultimate conclusion of each of the Vedas. And a lot of these philosophical ideas that are found in the Gita come from the Upanishads. Okay, so when Krishna is critiquing the Vedas, he's not critiquing the Upanishads. He's critiquing the earlier chapters of the Vedas would deal with ritual and traditional conceptions of religion. Krishna says, "You should know that which pervades all to be indestructible. No one can bring about the destruction of the imperishable being." This is a bit confusing. Krishna just said that which is real is neither temporary nor subject to change. That which pervades all being indestructible is referring to the self or the atma. Okay? What does this mean? The self is the nature of consciousness. The self is consciousness, right? And it pervades the entire body. Okay? So Krishna is saying you should know that the thing that pervades the entire body, which is the atma, is indestructible. An example that is given of this commonly is, think of a light bulb in a room. The light bulb is like the atma, and the light that it emits is the consciousness that pervades the room. Similarly, our atma is around our heart area, even though it's invisible. Our soul, I guess you could say. But it spreads its rays of consciousness across our body, such that this finger moves, right? This finger is moving because of my consciousness. Just like a light bulb pervades a room with light. Similarly, our consciousness, or our atma, which is localized in our heart, pervades our entire body, and it's indestructible. Krishna says, no one can bring about the destruction of this imperishable being, which is the atma, or the soul. Only the bodies inhabited by the eternal, indestructible, and immeasurable soul are said to be subject to destruction. So Krishna is saying, the body is what is subject to destruction. The Atma or the soul is eternal, indestructible, and immeasurable. Therefore, get up and fight, Arjun. Both one who thinks that the soul is the slayer and one who slays... Both one who thinks that the soul is the slayer and one who thinks that the soul is slain are confused. The soul neither slays nor is slain. So Krishna has just told us that we are a spirit, soul, and Atma, the self, not the body. So the question then becomes, who is performing action? Is this body performing action, or is it the self performing action? It would make sense intuitively to think that, well, when I'm touching the camera here, I'm doing it with my fingers, so my body is performing action. But at the same time, I am not the body, I am a soul. My consciousness is what is causing this action to be performed, right? The Atma is causing the action to be performed. And Krishna is saying, here's the clear answer. If you think that yourself, your Atma, is what's going to fight the battle, or is what's going to be killed, you are wrong. The Atma does not fight, nor does it be killed. So Krishna is telling Arjun, when you fight this battle, it's not you who's fighting it. It's your body, right? Your body is an instrument that performs an action because it is pervaded by consciousness. Right? As Krishna instructs Arjun, he addresses the erroneous notion that the self is an independent doer. Okay? Meaning, who has agency? Or what has agency? What is performing action? Is it the body or is it the self? The answer is it's the body that's performing action. So if it's the body that's performing action, and the thing that is being slain or hurt or defeated in battle is also a body, then what's the problem? You're not the one who's actually fighting. Your body is fighting. And the people whom you are fighting and defeating are actually bodies, not souls. Their souls will continue on. Krishna says, the soul neither is born, nor does it ever die, nor being will it ever cease to be, unborn, eternal, not subject to decay, primeval. It is not slain when the body is slain. How can one who knows this indestructible, eternal, birthless, imperishable nature of the self cause anyone to be injured or slain? Whom does he slay? Right? If Arjuna is fighting Dronacharya and Bhishma Pitama on the other side, who is he actually fighting? He's fighting their bodies, which already we know are destructible. We already know they're subject to change. We already know nasato vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate sataha. The body is subject to change. It's not eternal and ultimately real. So who is actually being slain? You know? Whom does he slay? Is he slaying Dronacharya, his Atma? No. It's the body. Now Krishna gives a beautiful analogy. Just as one dons new garments after discarding old ones, similarly the self or the Atma, which is in a body, accepts new bodies after discarding the worn out ones. Excellent analogy. And remember, this is all Sankhya because Krishna is describing. Remember, the first half of chapter 2 is Sankhya, the second half is Karam Yoga, and that second half on Karam Yoga is developed or matured into Bhakti Yoga. So Krishna is describing the properties of the self. It's eternal, unborn, not subject to decay. He's also describing the properties of the body, which is the opposite. It is not eternal. It is subject to decay. And we all know this to be true. And the purpose of all of this, again, is if we understand the difference between the Atma and the body, that which is temporary and that which is eternal, we can develop attachment. That discernment, understanding the difference between both things, is critical to developing detachment. With detachment, in Sankhya Yoga, we realize that there is no purpose in performing action, and we go and meditate in a forest. Now, of course, Krishna is not going to advocate for that. He's going to advocate that we should have this discernment, that we should understand the difference between the body and the soul. But in the second half of the chapter, for the 50th time, Krishna is going to tell Arjuna that it's better to perform action selflessly without attachment to the results than to just give up action altogether. The self or the Atma cannot be pierced by weapons, burned by fire, moistened by water, or withered by wind. Surely the Atma is indivisible, unburnable, insoluble, and cannot be dried up. It is eternal, all-pervading, changeless, unmoving, and primeval. What does it mean by the Atma is all-pervading? Sarva gataha. This is a relatively controversial topic. When we say that the self is all-pervading, what we mean is that the Atma pervades its entire body. Okay, just like the light bulb example I gave. If there's a light bulb in a room, the light will pervade the entire room. Similarly, when there is consciousness, the Atma, that consciousness spreads and affects the entire body. Okay? And each of these descriptions is going back to the previous verse. So since the soul is indivisible, cannot be cut, right? Krishna says the self cannot be cut by weapons. It cannot be burnt because it is unburnable. It's burned by fire. It cannot be moistened by water because it is insoluble, right? So each of these descriptions relates to the properties in the previous verse. It cannot be dried up and it can't be withered by wind because it cannot be dried up, right? So thus the effects stated in the previous verse are byproducts of the soul's qualities mentioned in this one. Does that make sense? It is said that the self is invisible, inconceivable, and unchangeable. Knowing this, you should not mourn for the body, because of course the body has all of the opposite properties. O Arjun, even if you think that the self is continually born and continually dies, you still have no reason to lament for it. So remember when we had our little description here, we just went over all of this. Krishna explains Sankhya. And then in 226 he says, even if for argument's sake we accept that the soul is non-eternal, if we accept that the self is continuously born and continuously dies, we still shouldn't lament because death is certain for all those who take birth. And so we're right here in that chapter. You have still no reason to lament for it. Why? Because death is certain for all those who take birth. Birth is just as certain for all who die. Therefore, do not lament in matters like this, which are unavoidable. O Arjun, all beings are unmanifest in their beginning, manifest in their middle period, and again unmanifest at their end. Thus, there is no cause for lamentation. What does this mean? Here, Krishna argues that one should not lament for the loss of the body, for it is always existing in terms of its elemental constituents, although in an unmanifest condition before and after the body actually manifests during the period. Although in an unmanifest condition before and after, the body actually manifests during the period of a lifetime. Thus, the body has a name and form only in the middle stage during its connection with the soul. What does this mean? Before you are born, you don't exist. But those constituent elements that make you up, that make up this body, the flesh and bone, exist. But in a sense, you are not manifest in your current form. You're unmanifest. When you die, you're unmanifest. Why? Because your atma, your self, your soul has left your body, and what's left behind is a dead corpse. That corpse is just a bunch of elements, right? So in that sense, before you are born, and once you die, your body is unmanifest. It's only manifest in that brief period in between, which is when you live your life to 70, 80, 90 years. So Krishna is saying all beings, all bodies are really unmanifest in the beginning, and they're unmanifest at the end when the corpse lies there. So the only period when a body is actually alive is when the Atma pervades it, when it exists there, and that's such a short period. Krishna has already described so many properties of the Atma, right? So many properties of the soul, right? It can't be pierced by weapons, burned by fire, moistened by water, withered by wind. It's indestructible, eternal, birthless, and perishable. After saying all of that, Krishna still says there's so much more to say. Some see the Atma as being a wonder. Others proclaim it to be wonder, while still others hear of it as a wonder. Yet even after hearing about it, none can fathom it. He said, I've just given so many descriptions of the Atma, of the self, but it's so unfathomable. It's so wonderful that some people cannot fully even describe it. So what does Krishna say? O Arjun, this Atma in every being is eternal and indestructible. Therefore, you should not lament for anyone. He's just repeating what he's already said. And now we talked about how Krishna then goes on to tell Arjun, well, on top of the fact that the body is temporary and the Atma is eternal, another reason you should fight is because you are a warrior. You are a Kshatriya, and it is your duty to fight against injustice. Krishna says, in consideration of your dharma or duty as a warrior, you should not hesitate, for there is nothing more righteous for a warrior than to fight for dharma itself. Why? Because Krishna is trying to make any plea possible to make Arjun fight. He wants Arjun to fight without any doubt, and so he's giving him every single reason to do it. You know, it's like if you go to a store and you want to buy something, there's like so many reasons to buy it. The price is really good, the quality of the material is really good, it's very stylish. There's like 3 or 4 different reasons, and therefore you buy the product. So Krishna's trying to sell his product to Arjun, and he's giving him all the reasons to do so. O Arjun, warriors who get such an opportunity to fight in battle, by good fortune rejoice, for this opens up the gates of heaven for them. Okay, we're not talking about liberation or mukti here. We're talking about Svargalok. If a warrior fights injustice and dies in battle, they attain heaven. However, if you do not fight this righteous war, having avoided your own duty as a warrior, you will incur evil and lose your good reputation. People will always speak of your infamy, and for a respectable person, dishonor is worse than death. The great warriors will think that you have left the battle out of fear, and thus those who once held you in high esteem will no longer take you seriously. Your enemies will speak the unspeakable of you, decrying your ability. What could be more painful than that? O Arjun, either you will die in battle and go to heaven, or having won the battle, you will enjoy the kingdom on earth. Therefore, stand with resolve and fight. So this is interesting. Krishna has given Arjun all of the spiritual reasons to fight, but now he's appealing to some of Arjun's material desires. He's saying, well, at the end of the day, you're a warrior. As a warrior, think about like the samurai code in Japan, right? Like when you're a warrior, your reputation matters. If you die in infamy, that's worse than winning. Or sorry, if you die in infamy, if you have a bad reputation, but you survive, that's not good. It's not favorable. So he's giving him every reason as a kshatriya, as a warrior, to fight for dharma. Even though that's not the primary focus of the chapter. The primary focus of the chapter is Sankhya Yoga in the first half, and the second half is Karma Yoga, and also Bhakti Yoga, which is hinted at, right? Because the mature stage, again, of Karma Yoga is Bhakti Yoga. But Krishna is very wise, and he knows that many people of many different proclivities and interests are going to study this conversation. And it's good to do one's duty and to practice dharma. So Krishna is also including that here. Arjuna, you have a duty as a warrior to fight. Krishna says, considering pleasure and pain, and gain and loss, victory and defeat to be equal, prepare yourself for battle without fear of incurring sin. Sukh dukkhe same kritva labha labha jaya jaya. Now, why does Krishna say this? Because so far he's talked about Sankhya Yoga. Now, remember we said that 239 is the transition verse from Sankhya Yoga to Karma Yoga. Krishna has said everything he wanted about Sankhya Yoga, and now he's hinting at what Karma Yoga is. What is Karma Yoga? We talked about it. Karma Yoga is performing one's prescribed duties without attachment to the results. So Krishna is hinting at Karma Yoga, saying, consider pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat to be equal. He's giving the definition of Karma Yoga without explicitly stating it because we're transitioning. And then we get to the transition verse 239. Krishna says, I've spoken to you of how to use wisdom in Sankhya Yoga. Remember, this first half was about Sankhya Yoga. Now hear about wisdom in yoga. And yoga here refers to Buddhi Yoga, which is also called Karma Yoga. And I mentioned this earlier. Anytime the word yoga is used by itself in the Gita, it always by default means Karma Yoga or Buddhi Yoga, even though every type of yoga has a word before it. So Sankhya Yoga is Sankhya Yoga. But anytime the word yoga is used alone, it's not referring to Sankhya Yoga, it's referring to Karma Yoga. So Krishna said, I've spoken to you of how to use wisdom in Sankhya. Now hear about wisdom in Karma Yoga. With this wisdom, Arjun, you will be free from the bondage resulting from karma. Okay? And this is a very important verse where we should read the commentary. Sankhya is used in a generic sense in reference to the analytical study of phenomena and the introspection that sheds light on the soul. Okay? Now, later in the Gita, the word Sankhya is associated with knowledge or jnana, while yoga is associated with karma. Okay? And I said this before. Another synonym for Sankhya Yoga is and later on, yoga or Karma Yoga is developed or matured into bhakti. Now, why are we having this distinction between Sankhya and Karma Yoga? Yoga implies, or Karma Yoga implies, the positive notion of union, whereas Sankhya Yoga denotes separation and discrimination, which bear negative connotations. So Krishna has encouraged Arjuna to separate himself from the negativity of material identification through proper discrimination. So Sankhya is what? Discriminating. The body is not the soul. So let's forget that. Let's just remember for a moment, the body is not the soul. You've separated the two. You've discerned between the two. Yoga, the word yoga or Karma Yoga literally means union. Now that you've done this negative dissociation, now we're going to unite. But we're not going to unite the self or the Atma with the material world, because then we've just undone that. We wanted to discriminate and figure out that they're separate. So first you have to extricate yourself from the matrix. Meaning, you have to separate yourself from the world. That is called Sankhya. And once you've made that separation, swap out the world for God and unite with God through Karma Yoga. So that's why this is a beautiful line. Karma Yoga is the positive notion of union, and Sankhya Yoga is the negative notion of separation. Sankhya Yoga is the negative notion of separation. The body and soul are different. And Karma Yoga is the positive notion of union. I'm going to become one with God by performing my duties selflessly as an offering to Him. And that dynamic oneness with God is the mature stage of Karma Yoga called Bhakti Yoga. Does that make sense? So here the word yoga implies the spirit of yoga, selflessness and sacrifice, the mother of love. While action in relation to sense objects with a view to enjoy them gives rise to karmic bondage, one cannot artificially divorce himself from action itself, right? Indeed, as we shall see, such artificiality in yoga is condemned. And what does this mean? I said earlier that this idea of separating oneself from attachment, of becoming detached, is very difficult. It's like giving up a Coca-Cola. You can't do that artificially. You can't artificially give up Coke. You need Diet Coke. You need something else. You need a higher taste, right? We said this here. You can't give up a Diet Coke. You need a higher taste. It's difficult to give up material attachments because when we try, our taste for them still remains. We need a higher taste, something more alluring, to give up material attachments. The same thing is being said here. Such artificially giving up things is condemned because it's not actually possible. Instead, Krishna recommends proper action in the spirit of detachment. He tells Arjuna that by acting in Karam Yoga, he will free himself from the bondage of karma and realize that the Atma, and he'll realize his Atma, he'll realize his true identity in the same way that someone performing Sankhya Yoga would, right? Because what does a Sankhya Yogi do? A Gyan Yogi. They go and meditate in the forest. But if you artificially decide one day that you want to go and meditate in the forest and become a monk, it's going to be very difficult. It's not going to be real renunciation, because as you're sitting in the forest beginning to meditate, you'll start thinking about all the things that you missed out on. So Krishna is saying, no, Arjun. I've told you about Sankhya Yoga in the first half, but in reality, Karam Yoga is important and you should perform it, because you are not yet eligible or ready to just go and meditate in a forest. That would be artificial. Right? And what is the beauty of this selfless action of Karam Yoga? Through the practice of the yoga of selfless action of Karam Yoga, one's heart is purified and knowledge begins to manifest. Knowledge of the self will not manifest in a heart cluttered by material attachment. So that is why we perform Karam Yoga, because it purifies us and makes us open to knowledge. Okay? And of course, there's a lot of commentary here. You can read it. Krishna says, in the practice of this dharma, no effort is wasted, nor is one's progress ever diminished. Even the slightest practice of this discipline protects one from great danger. Okay, so Krishna is saying, look, Karam Yoga is different, but as soon as you make a tiny bit of progress, it's saved permanently in your spiritual bank account. Any progress you make, any action you do, as Karam Yoga, will be there forever. It'll protect you from great danger. Okay. O Arjun, on this path one must be resolute in purpose with one's intelligence fixed. Indeed, those who are irresolute are endlessly distracted by other thoughts. So you have to be determined if you're performing Karam Yoga. Now Krishna is going to turn to his critique of the Vedas. We already read this basically verbatim when I wrote up a summary, but I'm just going to say it very fast. Such people of meager intelligence proclaim that the flowery words of the Vedas are all in all. They take delight in the letter of the Vedic law, saying there's nothing more than this. They are full of desires for opulence and material enjoyment and think that attaining heaven or a good birth in the next life is desirable. Thus they remain attached to ritualistic performance. So Krishna is saying that most people, when they think of religion, they follow these traditions and these rituals with the goal of attaining heaven or a good birth in the next life. Their goal is opulence and to enjoy. But these people are of meager intelligence. They take delight in what is written word for word without understanding the deeper meaning behind it. They remain very attached, and they have desires. And why is that problematic? Because too attached to material opulence and sense enjoyment, their minds are stolen away. And their interest in enlightenment or self-realization is not possible. Bhogeshwarya prasaktanam tyaparta chetasam vyavasatmika buddhi samadho navidiyate. Which means that if you want to move on the spiritual path, to have a spiritual journey, you have to slowly give up material enjoyment and opulence. Because those things ultimately cause suffering in the long term. Krishna says, the Vedas deal mainly with life within the three modes of material nature, the three guns. Arjun, you should transcend these three modes of material nature, becoming indifferent to them, fixed in truth, free from concerns for acquisition of comfort, and established in the self. Now Krishna gives the well analogy. Remember the well analogy? All purposes that are fulfilled by a well and more can be served by a reservoir of water. Similarly, all the purposes of the scripture, everything that the Vedas are saying, everything that is being said by the Vedas can be can also be given by a Brahman who knows their purpose. It's a bit complex. What that means is that the Vedas are like a well of water. They are limited. Karam Yog, the instructions that Krishna is giving to Arjuna, are like an ocean. And who is a Brahman? A Brahman is someone who has knowledge of the truth. Okay? It's by your qualities and your actions, not by your birth. So if you have knowledge of the truth, then you're going to go for the ocean and not the well. Okay? Now, Krishna's critiquing the Vedas, right? But why do the Vedas exist then? What's the purpose of creating them? Or for them to exist, right? Because the Vedas are actually eternal. The sections of the Vedas dealing with material advancement, which make up the greater aspect of the text, are for the general populace who are full of material desires. The rituals prescribed in the Vedas seek to regulate desires, bringing about religious life. Furthermore, they awaken faith in their words and those who practice the rituals. The real fruit of the subsequent faith in the scripture is that in time it causes people to look more deeply into the scripture, where they will learn about experiential life, spiritual life, as opposed to religious life. So Krishna is saying, look, the Vedas are like a well, but at the same time they serve a purpose. Most people in the world want to enjoy things materially. So it is better to have some rituals, some traditional religious ideas that propel us in the direction of righteousness, so that over time we can transcend religious life and go into spiritual life. Right? Well, what does the analogy of the well mean? One who realizes God, who follows Karam Yog, experiences all the bliss available through Vedic ritual and more. So this is a higher path. A well may dry up and its water may not be sweet. To drink from it, one must hoist up the water with considerable effort after having labored to find the well in the first place. Paths other than Bhakti or Karam Yog are compared to wells. Karam Yog, and the reason, by the way, Bhakti is used here, even though I'm saying the word Karam Yog, because again, remember, Karam Yog, when it develops into its mature stage, transforms from selfless action into selfless action as an offering to God. Right? So Krishna is saying that Bhakti or Karam Yog, on the other hand, is not like a well. It is oceanic in its outreach and depth of spiritual possibility. And whatever one can attain through other paths can be attained on the path of Karam Yoga or Bhakti with less effort. Make sense? Therefore, people who follow rituals and the letter of the Vedic law are drawing water from a well, which is very difficult because you have to expend a lot of effort. But those who follow this path of Karam Yoga or Bhakti, which remember, Karam Yoga in its mature state is Bhakti. I said that again even though I said it 30 seconds ago. It's much easier. It's like an ocean. Now, this is one verse that I didn't talk about much earlier. It's one that most people in India actually know. Karmanyevadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karma phal hetud bhur mate sangostva karmani. Krishna says, you are only eligible to act in terms of your acquired nature as a warrior. You are not entitled to the fruits of your action. You should neither be motivated to act by the hope of enjoying the fruits of your action, nor become attached to not acting at all. Krishna is saying, look, Arjun, you are a Kshatriya, you are a warrior. Your duty is to fight. Okay? And you're only allowed to fight because that is your prescribed duty. You're not entitled to enjoy the results of your action. And you shouldn't be motivated by that. You should also not become attached to action, and you also should not become attached to not acting. Isn't that very fascinating? Krishna is saying you shouldn't decide that you want to act and perform action, and you also shouldn't decide that you should just sit and not perform any action, because both are forms of attachment. Perform your duty fixed in the yoga of action, abandoning all attachment to success or failure or winner of wealth. Such equanimity of mind is what is meant by yoga. So this is where we get that first definition of yoga, right? Definition 1 of Karma Yoga. Performing action without attachment to the results. Krishna was hinting at it because after verse 239, the second half of this chapter starts. Perform your duty, fixed in the yoga of action, to abandon all attachment to success or failure, and to have an equiposed mind. A mind in equilibrium is what yoga is called. Why? O Arjun, action motivated by the desire to enjoy the results of one's work is far inferior to disciplined intelligence. Krishna says, take refuge in wisdom. Those whose actions are motivated by the desire to enjoy the fruits of action for themselves are miserly. One whose intelligence is disciplined to act in this way rids himself of both good and bad karma. Therefore, devote yourself to yoga, the art of work. So this is the second definition of yoga. Yoga is the art of work. Why? Because whereas acting with attachment causes us to be bound to karma and to experience, into sort of experiences that we'll later have to reap, by performing karam yoga, you become mukt, or free from both good and bad karma. And one question you would ask is, well, what's wrong with good karma? Bad karma I don't want anyways, but isn't it also favorable to have good karma? The answer is no. Because that doesn't mean you don't perform good acts. It means you don't perform good acts with an expectation of anything in return. Because when you do that, you'll get that thing in return, and that'll keep you bound in the material world, in sansar. You want to become free from the material world. Krishna says, those established in yogic wisdom, the wise who have renounced the fruits of action and are thus released from the bondage of rebirth, attain that abode that is without anxiety. Earlier, Krishna was talking about heaven. Now he's talking about an abode that is without anxiety. This is not heaven. The abode that is without anxiety is mukti. Pad means like place, abode. You'll get mukti, liberation from the material world, not heaven. If you want heaven, perform good acts with a desire of something good in return, and you'll get good karma and you'll enjoy heaven. But the issue with heaven is you go there, you enjoy for a temporary amount of time, and then you come back down, because heaven is in the material world. You have to come back down and be born again. This is that famous verse about the forest. Yada te moha kalilam buddhir vyati tarishyate tada gantasi nirvedam shvatavasya shvatasya cha. When your mind emerges from the forest of illusion, you shall become disgusted with all that has been heard and all that is to be heard. Therefore, when your intellect is fixed and not perplexed by scriptural injunctions, you shall attain yoga samadhi. So Krishna again is critiquing the Vedas. He's saying, look, you spent your entire life performing traditional religious rituals. When your mind emerges from that thick, dense forest of Vedic scriptural injunctions, you'll realize, like, what have I been doing my whole life? You'll be disgusted with the so-called purpose of life. You'll ask yourself, like, what was the purpose of all of this? You'll say, enough is enough. I want to know the absolute truth. And at that point, when you've reached that stage of wanting to know the absolute truth, after emerging from a dense forest, after being lost in a forest, right? The Vedas are like a forest that you just get lost in, thinking that rituals are the purpose of religion and life. Krishna says no. Once your mind emerges from that forest, you'll reach a much more beautiful place in Karam Yoga. Now Arjuna is a bit confused. Having heard about the abode that lies beyond religious life, Arjuna thoughtfully inquires about those in this world who have attained that destination. He asks Krishna a fourfold question about what the qualities of someone who've attained this state of yogic meditation, of self-realization are. And this is important because Krishna is saying that after someone attains yoga, they will attain a abode that is without anxiety. That might make you think, well, that means I'll become liberated or attain moksha after I die, after this body dies, right? The answer is no. You can attain liberation or mukti in this present life. And what does that mean? You become free from suffering. You transcend all suffering and you live peacefully. That is moksha, that is liberation in this life. And then after, if you attain that in this life, when this current body passes on, then you attain the abode that is without anxiety. So Arjuna wants to know, what are the characteristics of one who is accomplished in meditation and steady in intelligence? How does such a steady person speak? How does he sit? How does he move? Talked about this earlier. Sitting here implies how the realized Atma, or self, withdraws from the world, while his movement involves the manner in which he interacts with the world. Because Krishna is not asking Arjuna to give up all action. He's not asking him to go and meditate in a forest. So Arjuna is asking him, how does such a person who is performing Karma Yoga stand or move? Meaning, how does he be involved in the world? And how does he sit? How does he then sometimes meditate and focus? Krishna says, O Arjuna, one who, having renounced all desires born of the mind, is satisfied in the self and by the self, is said to be one whose insight is steady. What does it mean to be satisfied in the self and by the self? What this means is that most of us are satisfied by external objects. We get food, we're happy. We get the attention of others, we're happy. We get money, we're happy. We have a nice place to stay, that makes us happy. Krishna is saying that's all an illusion. To be truly happy is to be satisfied by yourself. You don't need anything external. As long as your basic needs are fulfilled, there's a phrase that's typically said, right? Money can't buy happiness. That's what Krishna is saying here. Because it's true. Money can't buy happiness. You can buy happiness by being satisfied with yourself. And if you reach that stage of being satisfied in yourself, by yourself, without the need for anything else to give you a sense of meaning or validation, that means you're steady. That means you're making progress in Karam Yoga. Right? Such a person is steady. Amid suffering and happiness, his mind is neither deluded nor delighted. He who is free from desire and whose passion, fear, and anger have subsided is said to be a sage of steady mind. It's all about desires, which give rise to passion, fear, and anger. One who is free from all material affection, who upon attaining that which is pleasant or unpleasant neither praises nor disapproves, stands firm in wisdom. This is very fascinating. Krishna is saying this person attains things that are pleasant or unpleasant. He doesn't complain about the bad things. He doesn't disapprove of them. But he also doesn't get intoxicated with praise. When he gets something pleasurable or some praise, he doesn't become obsessed with it. He doesn't make it his entire identity. And when this person completely withdraws his senses from their objects, like a tortoise draws its limbs within its shell, his wisdom stands firm. Now this seems very difficult. So far I'm reading this, I'm like, this seems impossible. You're asking me to withdraw all my senses like a tortoise withdrawing its limbs within its shell, to become free from all desire and passion, fear, and anger, and to become a sage of steady mind. I'm just an ordinary person. That's not possible. This is what 259 is about. Remember we talked about the verses about bhakti, about how the Gita is actually a summary of the second chapter of the Gita, is a summary of the entire text. We said, Garam Yoga is performing action selflessly. When that selfless action is performed in meditation and devotion to God, as an offering to God, it becomes Bhakti Yoga. So it's not easy to give up material attachments, to become free from desire, to withdraw our senses like a tortoise. Why? Because we as embodied beings might fast from feeding our senses. We may try to give up sense pleasure, to give up our attraction to material things, turning away from objects, but our taste for those objects still remains, right? So if I have a cake sitting on the table and I'm like, I'm not going to eat it, but I'm still thinking about it, well, I've defeated the purpose. I'm not detached now just because I'm not eating it. In fact, I am very attached, because the person who gets the cake and eats it, as soon as they eat it, they're satisfied. That's at least better than me, who sees the cake there and I'm salivating over it. I'm constantly thinking about it. I'm even more obsessed with it. The taste for those objects remains. However, one who does the same in the course of experiencing a higher taste derived from seeing God loses the very taste for some objects as well. Thus he remains fixed. And this is what Bhakti Yoga is. I gave the example of Coke. You can't give up a Coke. But if you have a Diet Coke, you might be able to. You can't give up material attachment. But if you experience something of a higher taste, by experiencing God, it's much easier to give up a taste for material objects. That is what Bhakti Yoga is. And thus you'll remain fixed. This previous thing, which seemed impossible, of withdrawing your senses like a tortoise with its limbs in its shell, now that becomes possible. Because now everything you're doing, everything you're eating, everything you're saying, every action you're performing is an offering to God. And thus you're still in the world. Because remember, Arjuna asks, hey Krishna, how do I move in the world? How do I interact with the world? And Krishna is saying, you interact with the world. You don't go and meditate in a forest and say, I'm never going to eat, I'm never going to talk. Take all of these vows and renounce the whole world. No. You engage in the world, but you do it. Any engagement you do is a service to God. And by making it an offering to God, you experience a higher taste, such that you are not attached to the things you're doing. Indeed, O Arjun, the senses are so strong that they can forcibly carry away the mind of even a discriminating person. Krishna is saying, look, Arjun, your senses are so strong. You don't have the strength to control them on your own. But if you restrain the senses, you try to, and you discipline yourself, and you fix yourself on me, then you'll become steady in wisdom. And this is, again, where I talked about Krishna using the first person. In 261, Krishna answers Arjun's questions from 254. How should someone sit? Remember, Arjun asked, how should I sit? How should I move around? By restraining the senses and sitting, fixing their consciousness on me to experience a higher taste, from 259. And Krishna uses the first person, right? He says, matparaha. Right? And interestingly, when Krishna is talking about sitting, there are many yogic practices, like gestures and poses, meditative poses that you do while sitting down. So Krishna here is also hinting at the 6th chapter, which is about dhyana yoga, or the yoga of meditation. Remember, I told you there are 3 types of yoga: Sankhya yoga, or Gyan yoga, Karam yoga, or Buddhi yoga, and Bhakti yoga. And then there is what is called Dhyan yoga, or Ashtang yoga, which is basically just meditative practices which can be incorporated into all 3 types of yoga. So Krishna's talking about sitting down. He's saying that you have to experience a higher taste and fix your consciousness on me, Krishna, in the first person, meaning not just some abstract, remember we talked about this? Not just some abstract force in the universe, an abstract animating form of God, but on the personal form of Krishna, right? With the peacock, with the flute, with the blue rain cloud color. And again, the sitting posture that Krishna has recommended, which is what meditation should be in a seated environment, will be talked more about in chapter 6 when we talk about meditation. Now, this is the verse on Vedic psychology, right? Probably one of the most significant verses. Dhyayato vishayan pumsa sangasteshu pajayate sangat sanjayate kama kamat krodho abhijayate krodat bhavati sammoha sammohat smriti vibrama smriti bramshat buddhinasha buddhinashat panashati. When one contemplates the sense objects, attachment for them is born. As soon as you think about something, you want something, now you have attachment. As soon as you are attached to something, desire is born. Attachment is a more mild form of desire. It's not lust. It's just like you think about something. As soon as you start thinking about something a little bit, desire or lust for emerges. Now, if that desire isn't fulfilled, you become frustrated and angry. If it is fulfilled, you keep wanting more, and you're never satisfied, so you're still frustrated. From that frustration, you're under delusion. When you're deluded, you lose your memory. You forget what is right and wrong. And when you forget what is right and wrong, you can't make the right decision. The power of discrimination or discernment, Sankhya, is lost. And with the destruction of your discrimination, your ability to tell right from wrong, the eternal from the non-eternal, the Atma from the body, yourself is lost. You fall down completely. Now, everything Krishna has described is really very difficult. Krishna is saying, even if you contemplate something, it leads to this chain reaction where contemplation leads to attachment, attachment leads to desire, desire leads to anger, anger leads to delusion, delusion leads to loss of memory leads to lack of intelligence or discrimination, and that leads to your completely fall down. That's like impossible. What, I should just never think about anything? No. However, even while moving among the sense objects, Krishna previously said, withdraw your senses like a tortoise withdrawing its limbs from the shell, within its shell. This is very difficult to do. So Krishna said, this is not possible. You need a higher taste. And that higher taste is me, right? And so once you have that higher taste of me, even while moving among the sense objects, you're still engaging in the world. You're free from attachment and aversion. Why? Because now you're relying on the strength of God. You have God's grace. Does that make sense? In other words, you can try to be like that tortoise withdrawing its limbs into its shell. I mean, you can try to artificially control your senses, control desire so that you become detached, but that's not actually possible for most people. It's very difficult. But as soon as we experience a higher taste, we do selfless action, Karam Yoga, as an offering to God. Now it's Bhakti Yoga. With that mindset, we attain God's grace, which thus makes it easier to be attached. And why do we want to be detached? Because it brings peace. Because attachment and desire can never be fully satisfied. It leads to frustration. For the pure-minded, all suffering ceases. Without a doubt, he who has attained purity of mind soon develops steadfast intelligence. Why is this important? Unless one is disciplined in yoga, one cannot have clear intelligence. Unless one is so disciplined, one cannot engage in meditation. Without meditation, there is no peace. And how can one have happiness without peace? So Krishna is saying, look, if you want happiness and peace in life, this is the procedure. You can't be too attached to objects, to the results of your action, to people, to places, to things. Because that'll lead to frustration when those desires are not fulfilled. You'll never be happy. Krishna says, whichever one of the roving senses the mind runs after, that sense carries away one's intelligence, just as the wind carries away a ship on water. Right? Krishna is comparing the senses to a ship, right? If the mind runs after a specific desire, it's like a ship being pushed by the wind into water. There's no control you have. Wind is very powerful, right? That's why ships have sails. Therefore, one who completely withdraws his senses from sense objects is fixed in wisdom. This seems so impossible, to withdraw your senses from sense objects. Why? Why should we try this? Why? Because there are two types of people. People who are spiritual and people who are more materialistic, right? This is the night and day analogy. That which is night for all sentient beings is like a day for one whose senses are controlled. That which is the time of awakening for a sentient being is like the night for the introspective sage who sees. This is an answer to the previous verse. This seems impossible, right? How can you completely withdraw your senses? Since we never see anyone in this world whose senses are not functioning on some level, how can the complete sensual withdrawal mentioned in the previous verse be possible? One of the commentators, Sridhar Swami, raises this question in his introductory remarks on the present verse. Here Krishna explains more clearly the experience of the enlightened soul, right? Arjuna asked earlier, how does such a person speak, sit, and move? Krishna didn't say, well, that person is not attached to anything and therefore they don't do anything. No. He didn't say that. Such an enlightened person sees and acts in the world and so on, but his seeing is different than that of the ordinary person. Just as an owl sees during the night and is blind during the daylight hours, so also one who has realized God sees only God and his service in this world and not the objects of sense enjoyment. Because the enlightened soul remains neutral in relation to happiness and distress, he appears to be asleep. And in reality, he is awake to the true nature of these polar opposites, and thus he alone in this world is alert. In other words, when most people are asleep to spiritual realization, to spiritual topics, a wise person, an introspective sage, is awake to them. Okay? And when most people are awake to material enjoyment, a spiritual person is asleep, meaning he's not indulging in those material things. He's still engaging in the world. He's still seeing and walking around. But he sees only God and his service in the world. He does everything for God, and everywhere he goes, he tries to see God's beauty. And therefore, he can never be bound. He doesn't withdraw his senses like a tortoise within its shell. It's not possible. He experiences a higher taste. Can't give up the Diet Coke. He can't give up the Coke. He needs a Diet Coke. He gives up a higher taste. My apologies. He gives up material attachment in favor of something that fulfills his taste. He gets a higher taste, an experience of God. And therefore he can roam around and engage in the world without becoming attached. Why? As the ocean remains still, even while rivers enter into it, he who remains unmoved in spite of all desires attains peace, not he who strives to fulfill such desires. Krishna is saying, it's like a bunch of rivers flowing into an ocean, and the ocean does not become disturbed. All of the senses are like rivers. Everywhere you go, there's all of these material objects, power, money, fame, pleasure that are pulling at you for your attention, trying to grab your attention. They're like rivers, and you're like the ocean. But because you're focused on God, and you're spiritual, those rivers flow in, and the water in the ocean remains still. You remain still. You don't become attached, even though all these objects are around you. A person who has abandoned all desires for sense indulgence acts free from desire, indifferent to any sense of ownership, and free from any ego. He attains peace. Okay? Having attained this divine state, he's never under illusion. If one is fixed in this consciousness, the spirit of detachment, the spirit of being focused and meditative on God, even at the moment of death, they didn't do anything their entire life, but at the moment of death it happens. Somehow they can think of God. They're not attached. They attain Brahma Nirvanam, the cessation of all suffering. And I talked about this earlier. Nirvana means to blow out, as one does a candle to extinguish its light. The word nirvana has a negative connotation, and thus Buddhism has sometimes been considered a negative form of spirituality. It is negative, however, in a positive way. Its goal is to negate the suffering that is considered that it considers the world to consist of. However, cessation of all suffering is, of course, part of the goal of the Gita, but the goal of the Gita is much more than that. It's not just to end all suffering. Remember, we talked about that analogy about negative numbers, the numbers 0 and positive numbers, being sick, being non-sick, and being healthy. If you go from being from suffering to not suffering, that is nirvana. But to go from not suffering to actual bliss, spiritual bliss, to go from 0 to a positive number, to go from being not sick to actually being healthy, not just the absence of disease, but the actual presence of good health, that is Brahma. So Krishna is saying that if you do all of these things, you will attain a state in which suffering is absent and all bliss is present. Nirvana, Brahma. Okay? So that was long. This is a very long chapter which covered so many topics. Let's review very fast. Chapter 2 of the Gita is called the Yoga of Analysis, Sankhya Yoga. Sankhya means the analytical study of matter versus spirit. This chapter also serves as a summary of the entire text. Okay? Quick summary. Discernment between the body and the soul is known as Sankhya Yoga. When this discernment is aroused, detachment naturally follows and one's desire to perform action fades away. Attachment to pleasure, power, and prosperity impedes spiritual progress. Karma Yoga, Garam Yoga, is the path of selfless action, which can also bring about detachment. Meditation on Krishna, which is Bhakti Yoga, is the higher taste, the Param Drishtva, that makes such detachment possible. Thus, Garam Yoga, in its most mature stage, is not just the path of selfless action, but rather the path of selfless action offered to God. Sankhya Yoga is the path of detachment based upon the discernment between the body and the self. It's the idea that I'm not the body, but rather a spirit soul. This is discernment. You've separated body from soul. Why then, you ask yourself, should I get entangled in any material action? Any material attachment? As a result, you renounce action altogether, which is called Gadam Sannyas. So thus, knowledge of the eternal self, knowledge that the body and the soul are different, curbs the desire to act in the world at all, and so thus you go and meditate in a forest. Of course, Krishna talks about this in the first half of chapter 2. Sankhya Yoga is also called Jnana Yoga. It's also called Gadam Sannyas. The second aspect of yoga that is talked about in chapter 2 of the Gita, after verse 239, is Gadam Yoga, also called Nishkam Gadam Yoga. Nishkam just means without desires. Gadam Yoga is the path of selfless action, or performing one's prescribed duties without attachment to the results. Its other name is Buddhi Yoga. It's also called the path of renunciation of the fruits of action, or Tyag. Now, technical point. Performing selfless action as a sacrifice or offering to God transforms Gadam Yoga into Bhakti Yoga. Right? So thus Gadam Yoga and Bhakti Yoga become one. But Bhakti Yoga is also much more than that. So when you do action selflessly, that's Gadam Yoga. But now, as soon as you make that selfless action a sacred offering to God, Gadam Yoga becomes Bhakti Yoga. I would pause the video here just for a quick summary. Again, this is a long video because this is meant to be comprehensive. Everything we covered in this document before reading the chapter, we covered again when we read the chapter. The purpose was for us to have an introduction and then to read the chapter. And so I would pause and read this again. I don't want the video to get too long, so I won't do that. Pause that here. Read this quick summary. (239) is the transition verse. Now, 259, 261, and 264 are about Bhakti Yoga. And then we end. Some quick notes. And then we'll just talk about notable verses in the last 10 minutes. Because remember, at the end of every chapter, I want to talk about some important verses. Chapter 2 is very long, so we have a lot. So quick notes. The body is transitory, limited, and imperishable, but the Atma is eternal, real, and imperishable. Therefore, one should neither lament the destruction of the perishable nor aspire to maintain the imperishable. This is discernment. In order to distinguish the real, the Sat, from the unreal, Asat, discernment is all that is necessary. Discernment is needed in all three disciplines of action, knowledge, and devotion. Right? So that Sankhya aspect, which the first half of the chapter is about, is needed in every form of yoga, whether it's Karma Yoga, Sankhya Yoga, or Bhakti Yoga. Why? Because when a person discerns between the self and the body, which is what Sankhya is, the desire for liberation is aroused. When discernment is aroused, enabling individuals to distinguish between the Atma and the body, they renounce their affinity for the transitory objects of the world, including the senses, mind, and intellect. Then their intellect becomes purified and balanced. When people firmly resolve to attain liberation, favorable or unfavorable circumstances cause no obstacles, and thus they attain equanimity. When people resolve to attain realization of God, their attachment and attraction to the world begin to disappear. Attachment to pleasure, power, prosperity, or relationships is the main obstacle to the attainment of mental resolution. And this is critical. The problem is not with objects, power, prosperity, etc., but with the attachment to them. And finally, in Gyan Yoga or Sankhya Yoga, discrimination between the body and the self is predominant. In Bhakti Yoga, surrender and faith are. In Karma Yoga, resolute intellect is. So Krishna recommended at the beginning of the chapter, before verse 239, make sure you have the understanding that the body and the Atma are different. That is the predominant aspect of Gyan Yoga. In Bhakti Yoga, you still have that understanding, but now you're experiencing a higher taste. You surrender and you have faith in Krishna, and he gives you the strength to become detached. And in Karma Yoga, you perform your actions, your duties, without being attached to the results. But it requires on you being very disciplined. You're relying on your own strength. You're not relying on surrender and faith to give you the strength of God. Okay. Finally, we're going to finish with some notable verses. This is a sort of glossary for you to remember. If you want to come back and say, what are the most important verses from the chapter? These are verses that are worthy of memorizing. Okay? It's a lot of them because there are a lot of important verses in this chapter because it's a summary of chapter 2. 2.7. Surrender to your guru is important. Karpanya dosh pahat svabhava. Shishyasteham shadi mam tvam prapannam. This is when Arjun surrenders to Krishna, my apologies, and accepts him as his guru, which makes it possible for Krishna to then give him knowledge. In 2.12, Krishna talks about the plurality and eternality of the self. He rejects Advaita Vedanta, the idea that God and the individual Atma or soul are one. He does this by saying, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you nor all these kings, nor shall any of us cease to exist in the future. Krishna is stressing that even in the future, even if you are enlightened and you attain liberation, you will still have your individuality. And why is this important? Because you can't have loving devotion unless you are an individual serving God. Krishna describes the difference between that which is real and unreal, that which is eternal and ephemeral, that which is spiritual and material, meaning the soul versus the body. That which is subject to change, asat, the body, is not eternal or real. That which is real is neither temporary nor subject to change. It cannot be destroyed. This is the conclusion the Seers of Truth reached after deliberating on both. Na sato vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate satah. This is before Krishna begins to describe Karma Yoga. He describes the equanimity of mind, considering pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat to be equal. Prepare yourself for battle without fearing sin. Sukh dukkhe same kritva lava lava jaya jaya. In 239, Krishna distinguishes between Sankhya Yoga and Buddhi Yoga, also called Karma Yoga. This is a transition verse. I have spoken to you of how to use wisdom in Sankhya Yoga. Now hear about wisdom in Karma Yoga. With this wisdom, you will be free from all bondage resulting from karma. 242 to 243 is when Krishna mounts his critique of the Vedas. He says the Vedas are misunderstood. Common religion tends to be ritualistic and dogmatic. Okay? In 244, Krishna says that material opulence and sense enjoyment must be curbed for spiritual progress. But again, this is hard to do without a higher taste. Right? Krishna says, Bhogeshvarya prasaktanam tyapaharta chetasam vyavsatnika buddhi samadona vidiyate. Krishna says in 245 that the Vedas deal with three modes of material nature. Traigunya Vishaya Veda. Right? And therefore, we have to transcend the three modes. 246, Krishna gives the analogy of the well. He compares the Vedas to a well, And he compares Karam Yoga and devotion to him as a big reservoir of water, an ocean. All the purposes that can be fulfilled by the Vedas, by a well, can also be fulfilled by devotion to Krishna directly. Krishna gives his first definition of yoga in 248. Yoga is equanimity of mind. Perform your duty, fixed in the yoga of action, abandoning all attachment to success or failure. Such equanimity of mind is what is meant by yoga. In 250, Krishna gives a second definition of yoga. Yoga is the art of work. Yoga karma sukoshalam. Meaning when you perform karam yoga, you do not create any good or bad karmas. You don't have to come and reap the results of the actions that you do. 252 to 253, Krishna says that when you become disillusioned with the world, spiritual wisdom sprouts. He does this by comparing the Vedas to a dense forest. When your mind emerges from the dense forest of illusion, you shall become disgusted with all that has been heard and all that is to be heard. You'll become disillusioned with the world and all notions of ritual and tradition. And when that happens, your mind will be fixed and you'll be open to spiritual wisdom. Arjuna asks in 254, what are the characteristics of an enlightened being? How does he sit? How does he speak? How does he move? Remember, sitting means how does he sit down and meditate, detach himself from the world? Movement means how does he engage with the world? Krishna said, great question. You can't give up attachment in the world without experiencing a higher taste. One embodied may fast from feeding the senses, turning away from their objects, but the taste for those objects remains. However, one who does the same in the course of experiencing a higher taste derived from seeing God loses the very taste for sense objects as well, thus he remains fixed. Krishna responds to Arjuna's question from 254. Arjuna said, how does such a self-realized person sit? Krishna says that he sits by meditating on my personal form because I, Krishna, am that higher taste. Krishna uses the first person. Restraining the senses and disciplining oneself, one should sit fixing one's consciousness on me. Such a person is known to be steady in wisdom. Then Krishna describes Vedic psychology. Desire is the root cause of suffering. And this is actually a notion that is also found in Buddhism. Right? You'll find the Four Noble Truths. The first one is sarvam dukkham. Everything is suffering. Dhyayato vishayan pumsa sangasteshu pajayate sangat sanjayate kama kamat kruto vichayate krodat bhavati samoha samohat smriti vibrama smriti brahmchad buddhinasha buddhinashat vinashati. You can read the translation here. 269, Krishna says, the interests of the spiritually awakened and the spiritually asleep are opposite, like day and night. Right? Night means having a lack of interest in something. Remaining awake means having an awareness of our interest in something. So a spiritual person, for them, they have a lack of interest in material things. They are asleep at night, in a metaphorical sense, when those things are occurring. Right? They're not going to go out at 9, 10, 11 p.m. in places they shouldn't be. In places that are going to make spirituality difficult to center. At the same time, they're awake. They're aware of and are interested in things that most people are asleep to, in spiritual wisdom. This is a great analogy. Finally, Krishna says that after you've done all this, you'll attain Brahma Nirvana. Right? This divine state. If you're fixed in this consciousness, even at the moment of death, you will attain Brahman in the cessation of all suffering. So that does it. That's chapter 2 of the Gita. This is going to be the longest video in this entire series. I apologize, but it was a lot to cover, but this is incredibly comprehensive, and I tried to repeat each thing about 5 to 10 times. And it should be crystal clear now, hopefully. What happens in chapter 3? Well, Krishna's talked about primarily Sankhya Yoga and Karam Yoga. Sankhya Yoga before verse 239 and Karam Yoga after verse 239. He talked about Bhakti Yoga a little bit, but that isn't really a main focus. It's just put in there because this is a summary of the entire Gita, and Karam Yoga in its mature state is Bhakti Yoga. But Arjuna is going to be confused now. Right? He's going to wonder. He's going to ask Krishna, which is superior, Sankhya Yoga or Karam Yoga? That's not a question that has been answered in this chapter. And that is where we will pick up in chapter 3. Thank you for watching this video. Appreciate it.